I sat at that dinner table in my juice-soaked white blouse, watching my 8-year-old nephew laugh, while my sister smirked and said, "Relax, he's just a kid." My parents, they told me I was overreacting. Nobody apologised. Nobody even offered me a towel. What they didn't know was that for 7 years, I'd been secretly funding their entire lifestyle. The mortgage payments, the roof repairs, my sister's business expenses. Over $120 to $1,000 of my money keeping them afloat while they treated me like I was nothing. So I smiled, went home, and with 3 clicks, I cancelled every single automatic payment. The next morning, my phone exploded. 87 missed calls. But that was just the beginning. Because when my sister tried to sue me, I discovered something that changed everything she'd been forging my signature on bank documents for over a year. Identity theft, fraud, criminal charges. My perfect family fell apart in ways I never imagined. This is the story of how I went from the invisible daughter to the one who finally made them see me. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. My name is Alison Butler. I'm 34 years old and I work as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. On paper, my life looks pretty good. Steady career, my own apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a reliable car, and enough savings that I don't worry about unexpected expenses. But here's the thing. Nobody in my family knows I've been living 2 completely different lives for the past 7 years. The first life is the one my family sees. To them, I'm the daughter who still hasn't figured things out. I'm not married. I don't have kids. I live alone in what my mother calls that little apartment, even though it's a perfectly nice 1-bedroom with hardwood floors and a view of the park. At family gatherings, when aunts and uncles ask what I've been up to, my parents usually jump in with something vague like, "Oh, Alison's still working at that office job," before quickly pivoting the conversation to my older sister Meredith and her son Lucas. That's the life they think I'm living. Small, unremarkable, slightly disappointing. The second life is the one I actually live. The one where I manage investment portfolios worth millions of dollars. Where I've been promoted 3 times in 6 years. Where my boss trusts me with the firm's most important clients. Where my salary would probably shock my parents if they ever bothered to ask. But I learned a long time ago that talking about my achievements only made things awkward. My mother would smile politely and say, "That's nice, dear," before changing the subject. My father would nod absently, clearly not understanding what I actually do. And Meredith, she'd find some way to make it about herself or about how corporate jobs aren't as meaningful as being a mother and entrepreneur. So I stopped mentioning it. I stopped trying to make them see me. But here's what really kept me up at night, despite being invisible at every family gathering, despite never getting a phone call that wasn't asking for something I'd been quietly holding their lives together for 7 years. Every month, like clockwork, I set up automatic transfers. $500 to my parents for household expenses, another $300 when Dad needed the roof repaired, emergency funds when Mum's car broke down, extra money when Meredith's struggling boutique consulting business hit another rough patch. I told myself it was what family does. You help. You don't keep score. The problem was they did keep score, just not in the way I hoped. They kept score of everything Meredith did right and everything I did wrong. They noticed when Meredith brought homemade cookies to Sunday dinner, but never mentioned the check I'd quietly slipped Dad the week before to cover the property taxes. They gushed over Lucas's mediocre school art projects, but barely glanced up from their phones when I tried to share that I'd just been asked to lead a major client presentation. I used to wonder what I was doing wrong. I worked hard. I was responsible. I helped whenever they needed it. I thought that's what being a good daughter meant, being reliable, being there asking for nothing in return. I followed every rule they'd ever taught me about family loyalty and doing the right thing. But sitting alone in my apartment on most Saturday nights, scrolling through photos of yet another family gathering I hadn't been invited to because it was just immediate family. Even though I was immediate family, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I didn't know that one dinner would change everything. To understand why that dinner mattered so much, you need to understand my sister, Meredith. Meredith is 3 years older than me, and from the day I was born, she's been the star of our family. When we were kids, her finger paintings went on the refrigerator, while mine went in a drawer. Her school concerts were attended by both parents with a video camera. Mine got mum alone with a distracted wave from the back row. When she got married at 25 to a guy named Derek, who worked in pharmaceutical sales, our parents threw them an elaborate wedding that I'm pretty sure they're still paying off. When I mentioned maybe having a small destination wedding someday, if I ever met the right person, Mum patted my hand and said, "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, dear." The marriage didn't last. Derek left after 4 years, right around the time Lucas turned 2. I never got the full story. Meredith painted herself as the victim of a man who couldn't handle a strong woman, while Derek's friends on social media posted vague things about toxic situations and finally being free. What I do know is that the divorce somehow elevated Meredith's status in our parents' eyes even higher. Now, she wasn't just their daughter, she was their brave, struggling single mother who needed extra support, extra attention, extra grace for everything. And Lucas became the golden grandchild, the centre of the universe, the little prince who could do no wrong. I tried to love my nephew, I really did. When he was a baby, I bought him thoughtful gifts and offered to babysit. But Meredith always had a reason why my help wasn't needed. The toys I picked were not educational enough. My apartment wasn't child-proofed. I wouldn't understand his routine because I wasn't a mother. Slowly, I got the message that my role in Lucas's life was to show up when summoned, admire him appropriately, and stay out of the way the rest of the time. By the time Lucas turned 8, he'd become a child I barely recognised as related to me. He had no concept of boundaries, no understanding that other people's comfort or property mattered. At family dinners, he'd run laps around the dining table while we tried to eat his hand, occasionally swiping through someone's plate or knocking over a glass. When I gently suggested once that maybe he should sit down, Meredith snapped at me in front of everyone. "He's a high-energy kid. Not everyone understands children who don't fit into boring little boxes." My mother immediately agreed. "Boys will be boys, Alison. You'll understand when you have your own." The implication was clear. I didn't have children, so I didn't get an opinion. I watched Lucas break a vase at Thanksgiving and get a mild "Oh, Lucas" from my mother, followed immediately by "accidents happen." I watched him interrupt every adult conversation, demanding attention, never being told to wait his turn. I watched him grab food off other people's plates, snatch the remote control during family movie nights, and throw tantrums when he didn't get his way, all met with indulgent smiles and excuses about his spirited personality. Meanwhile, Meredith herself seemed to grow more entitled with each passing year. Her small business, some kind of boutique consulting service, that I never fully understood, lurched from crisis to crisis. Every few months, there was a new emergency. A client who hadn't paid, an unexpected expense, a temporary cash flow problem. And every time I'd get a call from Mum or Dad, gently suggesting that it would really help Meredith out if I could contribute. They never asked directly for themselves anymore, but Meredith's needs became the family's needs, and somehow I always ended up being the solution. The worst part was how they talked about her struggles versus mine. When Meredith's business hit a rough patch, it was going through a challenging season, and she was so brave for persisting. When I mentioned my own work stress, like the time I was managing 3 major client accounts simultaneously and working 70-hour weeks, my mother said, "Well, that's what you signed up for with that kind of job, isn't it?" The sympathy flowed one direction only. I learnt to keep my mouth shut. "Keep the peace," my mother would say whenever I looked like I might object to something. Family is everything. We don't create drama. So I sat through dinner after dinner watching Lucas misbehave, watching Meredith take credit for things she hadn't done, watching my parents fawn over them both, while I faded further into the background. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I told myself that's what mature adults do. They don't compete for attention or keep score. But I felt it. Every single slight, every dismissal, every time Lucas destroyed something and I had to pretend it was charming. Every time Meredith made her passive-aggressive comment about my simple lifestyle or my freedom to do whatever I wanted because I didn't have real responsibilities. Then, last Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. Not a question, not an invitation. A demand. Family dinner this Saturday at Mum and Dad's, 6 p.m, be there. We need everyone present. No, please. No, are you available? No acknowledgement that I might have my own plans. Just an assumption that I'd drop everything because she'd commanded it. When I didn't respond immediately, a second text came through from my mother. Meredith is organising a special dinner. It would mean so much if you came, sweetheart. I stared at those messages for a long time. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant evening. Something in the way Meredith phrased it, we need everyone present, felt ominous, like I was being summoned to a performance where I'd be expected to play my usual role. The supportive sister, the generous daughter, the person who shows up and shuts up. I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home. But I didn't stay home. And the reason I didn't has everything to do with a conversation that happened 3 days before that dinner. I was at my desk on Wednesday afternoon, eating a sad desk salad while reviewing a portfolio analysis that was due by end of day. The office was mostly empty. Most people actually took their lunch breaks. Left the building, enjoyed the autumn sunshine. Not me. I'd worked through lunch every day that week, and honestly most weeks before that. It wasn't because I had to. It was because going home to my empty apartment or sitting alone in a restaurant somehow felt more pathetic than just staying busy. You're going to burn out if you keep this up. I looked up to find Margaret Chen standing in my cubicle entrance. Margaret was in her early 60s, one of the senior partners at the firm, and someone I deeply respected. She'd built her career in finance back when women were rarely taken seriously in the field, and she had a reputation for being brilliant, fair, and occasionally brutally honest. I'm fine, I said automatically the same thing I always said, just trying to get ahead of deadlines. Margaret didn't move. She just stood there studying me, with those sharp eyes that seemed to see through every polite deflection. You've worked through lunch every day this week. You were here until 8 last night. You came in on Saturday. She paused. What are you avoiding, Alison? The question caught me off guard. I'm not avoiding anything. I just have a lot on my plate. We all have a lot on our plates. That's the nature of this work. She stepped into my cubicle and leaned against the edge of my desk. But most people find time to eat lunch away from their computers. Most people leave at a reasonable hour at least a few nights a week. You don't. Why? I felt something prickle behind my eyes, that warning sign that tears might be coming if I wasn't careful. I guess I just don't have anywhere else I need to be. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Family obligations. I let out a bitter laugh before I could stop myself. Something like that. Tell me. And somehow, maybe because I was tired, maybe because Margaret was practically a stranger, and therefore safe to talk to, maybe because I'd been holding it in for so long, I told her. Not everything, but enough. About how my family only seemed to notice me when they needed something. About my sister, who could do no wrong, and my nephew, who was being raised without boundaries. About feeling invisible in my own family despite being the one holding things together financially. When I finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, Alison. It's self-destruction. I blinked. What do you mean? I mean that what you're calling being a good daughter or helping family isn't actually kindness if it's destroying you in the process. Real kindness requires mutual respect. What you're describing sounds more like a one-way street where you give, and they take, and nobody ever stops to ask if you're okay. But they're my family, I said weakly. Family is supposed to help each other. Help, yes. Enable, no. And from what you're telling me, you're not helping them. You're enabling them to never face consequences, never grow up, never learn to value what you give because they have never had to live without it. Margaret crossed her arms. When's the last time one of them asked how you were doing? Not as a polite greeting, but really asked. I opened my mouth to answer and realised I couldn't remember. Weeks, months, had it been over a year? That's what I thought, Margaret said gently. Look, I'm not telling you what to do with your family. That's your business. But I am telling you that you can't keep pouring from an empty cup. At some point, you have to decide what you're worth. And if they can't see it, maybe it's time to stop trying to make them see it. She left after the sat, returning to her office and leaving me sitting there with my half-eaten salad and a growing sense of unease. Her words played on repeat in my mind for the rest of the day, through my evening into the next morning. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-destruction. When's the last time they asked how you were doing? What you're worth, when? Saturday rolled around, I still hadn't responded to Meredith's text. My phone had been unusually quiet all week. No follow-up demands, no guilt-tripping calls from my mother. Just silence, which somehow felt worse than the nagging. The silence felt like they knew I'd show up eventually, because I always did. I was predictable, reliable, easy. I stood in front of my closet Saturday afternoon staring at my clothes and feeling a heaviness settle over me like a thick blanket. It wasn't just tiredness, though I was tired. It was something deeper, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of trying to earn love that maybe wasn't actually available. From years of being the easy daughter, the one who didn't make waves, the one who showed up and smiled and kept her hurt to herself because that's what kept the peace. I chose a white blouse. Practical, professional, clean. The kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't give anyone a reason to comment. I pulled my hair back into a simple ponytail and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. I looked sad. But I looked like someone who would show up for family dinner and play her role perfectly. As I drove to my parents' house, that heaviness only grew. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My jaw clenched my stomach in knots. Part of me, a small, hopeful part that I hated for still existing, thought that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this special dinner Meredith had organised would actually include me for once. Maybe they'd planned something nice. Maybe they'd finally see me as more than just the backup daughter, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to show up and shut up. But a larger part of me, the part that had learnt from years of disappointment, knew better. This dinner was going to be like every other family gathering, Meredith at the centre, Lucas running wild, my parents fawning over them both, while I sat quietly in the corner, invisible until someone needed something from me. I pulled into my parents' driveway and sat there for a moment, engine off, hands still on the wheel. Everything in my body was telling me to leave, to drive away, to finally prioritise my own peace over their expectations. Margaret's words echoed again. You have to decide what you're worth. But I didn't leave. I took a deep breath, grabbed the store-bought pie I'd picked up as my contribution, and walked toward the front door. I had no idea I was about to learn that lesson in the most humiliating way possible. Meredith opened the door before I could even knock. She was wearing a flowing bohemian dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her hair perfectly styled in loose waves that looked effortless, but definitely weren't. She glanced at the bakery box in my hands, and her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Oh, you didn't have to bring store-bought stuff? She said, already turning away to let me in. We have plenty of food. Actually, it's homemade, I said, following her inside. I picked it up from that little bakery on... Well, it's the thought that counts, Meredith interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. She didn't even look at the box again, just gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. You can put it wherever. I stood there in the entryway, holding my pie, feeling the familiar sting of being diminished within the first 30 seconds of arrival. It didn't matter that I'd actually gone out of my way to stop at the good bakery, the one with the hour-long lines on weekends. It didn't matter that I'd thought about what to bring, tried to contribute something nice. Meredith had already decided it wasn't good enough, wasn't worth acknowledging. The house smelled like roasted chicken and my mother's signature herb potatoes. I could hear my father's laugh coming from the living room, the television playing some sports channel. As I walked towards the kitchen to set down the pie, Lucas came tearing around the corner at full speed, nearly crashing into me. "Whoa, buddy," I said, stepping aside just in time. "Maybe slow down a little." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. He just kept running, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floors as he made another lap through the dining room. I watched him go, already feeling tired. My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Alison, oh good, you made it. We're just about ready to sit down." She kissed my cheek, quickly distracted. "Lucas, honey, maybe use your indoor energy level?" Lucas ignored her too, completing another circle around the dining table. My mother just smiled fondly. "He's been so excited for tonight, so much energy today." I noticed she didn't ask how I was, didn't comment on the fact that we hadn't spoken in over a week, didn't seem to register that her text saying, "It would mean so much if you came," implied I might have had a choice, might have had other plans, might have had a life outside of being available for family dinners. We all moved into the dining room where the table was set for 5. My father came in from the living room, gave me a quick hug that felt more obligatory than warm, and we took our seats. I ended up in my usual spot, the chair at the end of the table, slightly removed from the main conversation flow, positioned perfectly to be overlooked. Lucas, of course, couldn't sit still. He climbed into his chair, then immediately climbed back out. He drummed his hands on the table. He grabbed for the rolls before grace was said, and when Meredith gave him a half-hearted, "Lucas, wait," he just grinned and did it anyway. "He's hungry," my father said, chuckling. "Growing boy." As we started passing dishes, Lucas leaned too far across the table, reaching for the butter, and knocked over his water glass. It toppled in slow motion, water spreading across the tablecloth and dripping onto the floor. For a moment there was silence. "Oh, Lucas," my mother said, but she was already laughing. "You and your long arms. It's okay. Accidents happen." Nobody moved to clean it up. They all just sat there smiling indulgently at Lucas, who had already lost interest and was now trying to stack his rolls into a tower. I quietly got up, grabbed some napkins from the sideboard, and started soaking up the water. I mopped the table, dropped to my knees to wipe the floor, all while conversation resumed around me as if I wasn't there. Nobody said thank you. Nobody even acknowledged that I'd cleaned up the mess. It was like I was a ghost, invisible hands fixing problems, while the real family members carried on with their evening. Dinner conversation flowed in its predictable pattern. Meredith launched into a dramatic story about a client who'd been impossible to work with and how she'd handled the situation with such grace and professionalism. My parents hung on every word, asking eye-going follow-up questions praising her patience and business acumen. "You're so good with difficult people," my mother gushed. "That's a real gift." Then Lucas's school came up. Apparently he'd gotten a good grade on a spelling test, and you'd think he'd won the Nobel Prize from the way everyone reacted. My father wanted to know every detail. My mother suggested they put the test on the refrigerator. Meredith beamed with maternal pride. I ate my chicken and potatoes in silence, chewing mechanically, watching the show unfold around me. This was my role audience member, the person who showed up to validate everyone else's importance while having none of my own. Finally, during a brief lull in the Meredith and Lucas appreciation session, I tried to contribute. "I actually had some good news this week," I said, my voice sounding too loud in my own ears. "My boss asked me to lead the presentation for our biggest client next month. It's a really significant account, and..." "That's nice, dear," my mother said, her eyes already sliding back to Meredith. But Meredith was saying something about the renovation plans. My father nodded eagerly. Yes, we wanted to talk about that. We're thinking of finally redoing the master bathroom, and we could use some advice on... Contractors are so expensive right now. Meredith jumped in. But I know someone who might be able to give you a discount. Let me make some calls. And just like that, I disappeared again. My accomplishment, something I'd worked toward for months, something that represented real recognition of my skills and value, was dismissed in half a sentence so they could discuss bathroom tile choices. I set down my fork carefully, afraid that if I held it any tighter, I might break it. Margaret's words came back to me. When's the last time they asked how you were doing? The answer was clear. They weren't going to ask. They never asked. Because in this family, I wasn't a person with feelings, achievements, or a life worth discussing. I was a supporting character in the Meredith show, and my job was to sit quietly and applaud. I looked around the table at these people I shared DNA with and felt like a complete stranger. Lucas was now out of his chair again, running his toy car along the edge of the table, making engine noises. Meredith was gesturing animatedly about grout colours. My parents were leaning in, fascinated, as if bathroom grout was the most riveting topic ever discussed. And I was invisible. Completely, utterly invisible. Then Lucas grabbed his cup of bright red juice. I watched him pick up the cup with both hands. It was one of those plastic tumblers with cartoon characters on it, filled almost to the brim with cranberry juice, the kind that stains everything it touches. He held it up high, examining it like he'd just discovered something fascinating, and I had a split second of recognition, a tiny alarm bell in my brain that said something was about to happen, but I didn't move fast enough. Lucas walked around the table, that cup still held up at eye level, and came up directly behind my chair. I felt him there, sensed his presence, but before I could turn around or say anything, he tipped the entire cup forward. The juice hit the back of my head first cold and shocking, then cascaded down over my shoulder and onto my lap. I gasped and jumped up my chair, scraping backward, but it was too late. The front of my white blouse was completely soaked through the red liquid, spreading across the fabric like blood. It dripped down onto my pants, onto my shoes, pooled on the chair I'd just vacated. I could feel it, sticky and cold against my skin, seeping through to my clothes underneath. Lucas giggled. Not a nervous laugh, not an oops, I made a mistake giggle. A gleeful, delighted laugh, like he'd just done something incredibly funny. He dropped the empty cup on the floor and ran back toward the living room, his laughter echoing behind him. I stood there dripping, stunned into silence. My hands were held out slightly from my body, not knowing where to go, what to do. I could feel juice running down my back, into my bra, down my stomach. My carefully chosen white blouse, the professional practical don't draw attention blouse, was completely ruined, stained bright red, clinging to my skin. The table had gone quiet. I looked up at my family, waiting for something. An apology, concern, some acknowledgement that what just happened was completely unacceptable. Instead, Meredith leaned back in her chair and actually smirked. That's the only word for it. Not a smile, not a grimace, but a smirk. Like this was somehow amusing. Relax, she said, drawing out the word like I was being ridiculous. He's just a kid. It's just juice. Just juice. Just juice that was now soaking through every layer of clothing I was wearing, making me look and feel like I'd been assaulted. Just juice that Lucas had clearly poured on me deliberately, not accidentally. Just juice that no one seemed to think required an apology or consequences. He did that on purpose. I said, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. He walked right up behind me and... Oh, come on, Alison, my father interrupted, setting down his fork with an exasperated sigh. Don't make a big deal out of this. Kids do things like this. It's not the end of the world. I looked at my mother, hoping for something different. Some maternal concern for her daughter, standing there, humiliated and soaked. Instead, she gave me that patient, condescending smile, I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You don't have kids, honey, so you don't understand how boys are at this age," she said gently, like she was explaining something to a child. "They're impulsive. They don't think before they act. Just let it go. It's not worth getting upset over." Not worth getting upset over. I was standing in their dining room drenched in cranberry juice, and my own mother was telling me it wasn't worth being upset. That I should just accept this humiliation quietly, the way I'd accepted everything else quietly for years. "I need to clean up," I said, still holding my arms out, juice dripping from my fingertips onto their floor. "Can I use your bathroom?" "The bathroom's upstairs if you want to rinse off," Meredith said casually, like she was giving me directions to the grocery store. She hadn't moved from her seat, hadn't offered to help, hadn't even pretended to be sorry. "We're having dessert soon, so try not to take too long." I stared at her. Try not to take too long. Like my being covered in juice was an inconvenience to her dessert schedule. I started to turn toward the stairs, my shoes squelching with every step when Meredith called after me. "Oh, and Alison Lucas is hiding in the living room because he thinks you're mad at him. Maybe when you come back down you could tell him it's okay. He's feeling really bad about it." I stopped walking. Slowly I turned back around to face the table. "You want me to tell him it's okay?" I repeated, not quite believing what I'd just heard. "Well, yeah," Meredith said, like this was the most reasonable request in the world. "He's 8. He doesn't need to feel guilty over an accident. You're making him feel bad by being all dramatic about it." "It wasn't an accident," I said carefully. He walked behind me deliberately and, "You're really going to make this into a thing?" My father cut, in his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "It's juice, Alison. You're acting like he committed a crime. The boy made a mistake. Go clean yourself up and let's move on." My mother nodded in agreement. "Your father's right. You're being too sensitive about this. Lucas is just a child. He didn't mean any harm." I looked around that table one more time. At Meredith lounging in her chair, with that smirk still playing at the corners of her mouth. At my father annoyed that I was disrupting his pleasant evening. At my mother and patronising, treating me like I was the problem for being upset about being deliberately humiliated. And I understood something in that moment with perfect, crystalline clarity. They weren't waiting for Lucas to apologise to me. They weren't planning to discipline him or acknowledge that what he'd done was wrong. They were waiting for me to apologise. To Lucas for making him feel bad by having the audacity to be upset about being treated like garbage. They wanted me to smile and say it was okay and make this 8-year-old boy feel better about the fact that he'd just poured juice all over me while his mother and grandparents laughed it off. They wanted me to once again be the easy one, the understanding one, the one who absorbed everyone else's bad behaviour without complaint, because that's what I always did. Margaret's voice echoed in my head. "You have to decide what you're worth." I stood there in my ruined white blouse, cranberry juice still dripping off my elbows, and something inside me that had been bending for years finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a clean break like a tree branch that's been weighted down too long, finally giving way. I looked at Meredith, at my parents, at the dining room where I'd spent so many evenings making myself smaller, quieter, less important so they could shine brighter. And then I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a polite smile, a real smile because suddenly I knew exactly what I was going to do. For the first time in 7 years, I was going to stop being easy. I was going to stop being convenient. I was going to stop funding the very people who treated me like I didn't matter. They were waiting for me to apologise. Instead, I smiled. That smile felt strange on my face, foreign almost, but also liberating, like I'd just discovered a muscle I'd forgotten I had. Standing there in that dining room, juice-soaked and humiliated, my mind suddenly flashed back to another family gathering 3 years ago. I'd been helping my mother carry dishes into the kitchen, when Lucas, he must have been 5, then came tearing through and crashed into me on purpose. Not an accident. I saw him line me up, adjust his trajectory, and slam into my legs at full speed. I'd stumbled backward and fallen hard against the staircase, the dinner plate shattering on the floor around me. I'd hit my elbow so hard I couldn't straighten my arm properly for a week. Meredith had rushed over, but not to check if I was okay. "Lucas, baby, did you get cut by the glass?" She'd scooped him up, examining him for injuries, while I sat on the floor surrounded by broken china and humiliation. When I'd pointed out that he'd run into me deliberately, she'd given me that same patient, condescending look. "Don't make it a big deal, Alison. He's little. He doesn't understand personal space yet. You're fine." And I'd said nothing. I'd cleaned up the broken plates, thrown away my favourite cardigan that had been stained with food, and pretended it didn't matter. Then there was the time last Christmas when Lucas grabbed my phone off the coffee table and threw it across the room because I wouldn't let him play games on it. The screen shattered into a spider web of cracks. My father had actually laughed. "Kids and technology, right, they don't know their own strength." Nobody offered to replace it. Nobody disciplined Lucas, and when I'd looked upset, my mother had pulled me aside and whispered, "It's just a phone, honey. Don't embarrass Meredith by making a scene about it. Just a phone. Just plates. Just juice. Always just something I should get over, something I should tolerate. Something that didn't matter because I didn't matter enough to defend." How many times had I bitten my tongue? How many times had I swallowed my anger, my hurt, my frustration, because keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity? How many years had I taught them that they could do whatever they wanted to me, and I would smile and take it? I taught them this. The realization hit me like cold water, even colder than the juice soaking through my clothes. They treated me this way because I'd shown them it was acceptable. Every time I said nothing, every time I cleaned up the mess and pretended it was fine, every time I put their comfort above my own self-respect, I was teaching them that Alison doesn't require apologies. Alison doesn't have feelings that matter. Alison will always be there, always understanding, always convenient. I created this dynamic as much as they did, not because I was weak. I understood that now, but because I'd been trying so hard to be good, to be easy, to be the daughter and sister and aunt who never caused problems. And in trying to be all those things, I'd erased myself completely. "Alison," my mother's voice cut through my thoughts. "Are you going upstairs to clean up the bathrooms?" "I know where the bathroom is, Mum," I said quietly. "I grew up here." Something in my tone made her blink, but she recovered quickly. "Well, don't take too long. We're going to have dessert, and I made your father's favourite cobbler." Not my favourite, my father's favourite, because of course. I looked at Meredith, who had picked up her phone and was scrolling through something, already bored with this whole situation. She'd gotten what she wanted. Her son faced no consequences. I'd been put in my place once again, and now we could all move on with the evening like nothing had happened. You need me to grab you a towel or something?" my mother asked, but she didn't get up. It was a polite offer with no action behind it, the kind of offer that sounds nice but requires nothing of the person making it. "No," I said. "I'll manage." I always managed. That was my role. Manage the mess, manage my emotions, manage everyone else's comfort level. Never ask for help. Never make demands, never rock the boat. Meredith finally looked up from her phone and I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe annoyance that I was still standing there, still dripping, still being an inconvenience when I should have disappeared upstairs by now. "Seriously, Alison, just go wash it off. It's not like the juice is going to stain your skin or anything. We want to have dessert." Just wash it off. Like the humiliation would rinse away as easily as the juice. Like I could scrub away 7 years of being treated as less than, as other, as acceptable collateral damage in the worship of Meredith and Lucas. I looked around the table, slowly taking in each person. My father had already turned his attention back to his plate, finishing his last few bites of chicken like nothing had happened. My mother was fussing with the serving dishes, preparing to clear the table. Meredith was back on her phone. And from the living room, I could hear the television Lucas had apparently moved on completely, already watching cartoons while eating the cookies my mother had given him as a pre-dessert snack. Not one of them was looking at me. Not one of them saw me as a human being standing there in ruined clothes, humiliated and hurt. I was furniture to them, a fixture. Something that would always be there, always functional, never requiring maintenance or care. And in that moment, standing in a dining room where I'd spent countless hours pretending to be part of a family that had never truly included me, I made a decision. I was done. Not angry done, not dramatic done, just done, finished, complete. The way you finish a book you're no longer interested in and close it with finality, knowing you won't pick it up again. Margaret was right. Kindness without boundaries wasn't kindness, it was self-destruction. And I'd been destroying myself for years, one small concession at a time, one swallowed hurt at a time, one accepted humiliation at a time. I'd been paying for the privilege of being treated poorly, literally funding my own mistreatment with monthly bank transfers while they made it clear I wasn't worth basic respect. I looked at my sister, who still hadn't apologised, who would never apologise, who was already thinking about whatever was on her phone screen, instead of the person she'd just allowed her son to humiliate. I looked at my parents, who had chosen once again to prioritise Meredith's comfort and Lucas's feelings over their other daughter's basic dignity, and I smiled again. This time, it felt natural, because I knew something they didn't know. I knew exactly how much of their comfortable life depended on my monthly contributions. I knew that the roof over their heads stayed in good repair because of me. I knew that Meredith's business emergencies got solved because of me. I knew that their entire financial stability existed because I had been funding it quietly, invisibly for 7 years. And I knew that with just a few clicks on my banking app, I could teach them something they should have learned a long time ago, that every relationship has a cost and respect should have been the minimum payment. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was powerless because I was quiet. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I smiled, and everything changed in that moment. I didn't go upstairs to clean up. I didn't say goodbye. I just turned around, walked through their house with juice still dripping from my clothes, and left. I heard my mother call after me, "Alison, where are you going? We haven't had dessert yet." But I didn't stop. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them anything anymore. The drive home was 23 minutes of cold, sticky discomfort. The juice had started to dry on my skin, making everything feel tight and itchy. My white blouse had gone from soaked to merely damp, the red stain now set permanently into the fabric. Every time I shifted in my seat, I could feel the tackiness of it against my back, my stomach reminded, with every breath of what had just happened. But I wasn't thinking about the juice anymore. I was thinking about my 27th birthday 4 years ago. I'd mentioned it was coming up in a family group chat, hoping maybe this year would be different. The day came and went with complete silence. No calls, no texts, no cards. 3 days later, when I finally mentioned that they'd forgotten, my mother had gasped and said, "Oh, honey, we've just been so busy with Lucas's baseball season. You understand?" And I'd said yes, of course I understood, even though what I understood was that my birthday would never matter as much as Lucas's T-ball games. I thought about the promotion I got 2 years ago, the one that came with a significant raise and more responsibility. I'd been so proud, so excited to share the news. I'd called my mother, and she'd said, "That's wonderful, dear," in the exact same tone she used when I told her I'd bought new dish towels. Then, she'd immediately changed the subject to ask if I could help with Meredith's car payment that month because business was slow. I thought about last Thanksgiving when I'd spent 8 hours cooking dishes to bring to their house, only to have Meredith complain that I'd made green bean casserole when she specifically said she was bringing green beans. "Now we have too many green beans, Alison. Didn't you get my text?" I hadn't gotten any text, but somehow I was the one who'd messed up, and I'd apologised for the confusion, while my perfectly good casserole sat untouched, because Meredith's version was the one everyone prefers. Memory after memory, each one a small cut I'd ignored at the time, all of them adding up to a picture I'd been refusing to see. I wasn't part of this family. I was a resource, a bank account, a problem solver who appeared when needed and disappeared when not, never causing trouble, never asking for anything in return. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and sat in my car for a few minutes, engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel. The silence felt enormous after the chaos of that dinner. I peeled myself out of the driver's seat, the fabric of my clothes making a slight squelching sound, and walked up to my apartment like someone in a daze. Once inside, I didn't go straight to the shower, even though every instinct screamed to get out of these ruined clothes. Instead, I went to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life and I pulled all up, my email scrolling back through years of messages. The pattern was so obvious now that I was looking for it. Every email I'd sent offering help, every message checking in, every time I'd volunteered my time or money or energy. The responses were brief, functional. Thanks, with no exclamation point. That works, with no gratitude. Can you also? Turning every gift into an obligation for more. I found the email thread from when my father's car broke down 2 years ago. I'd offered to pay for the repairs, nearly $2,000. His response, that would be helpful. Not, thank you so much. Not, we really appreciate this. Not even, are you sure you can afford it? Just acknowledgement that my money would be helpful, like I was a loan company, not his daughter. I scrolled further and found messages from times I tried to set boundaries. Once I'd suggested maybe we could rotate who hosted holiday dinners, so it wasn't always at my parents' house with Meredith getting all the credit. My mother's response, that seems complicated. Let's just keep things simple. You know how stressed Meredith gets. Translation, your needs are complicated. Our needs are simple. Adjust accordingly. Another time I'd asked if we could please acknowledge my birthday this year, even if it was just a phone call. Meredith had responded to the group chat, wow, didn't realise we had to schedule affection now. Some of us are busy with real responsibilities. And I'd backed down immediately, apologised for being demanding, said it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. It was all a big deal. The accumulation of every dismissal, every forgotten birthday, every interrupted story, every request for help that never came with corresponding help offered in return. I closed my email and opened my banking app, my heart starting to pound. I navigated to my transaction history and started scrolling. And scrolling and scrolling. The automatic transfers to my parents started 7 years ago, right after I got my first major promotion. $500 a month, every month for 84 months. That was $42,000 right there. But then there were the extras, the emergency transfers, when Dad needed roof repairs, when Mum's furnace died, when property taxes came due. I added them up in my head conservative estimates and felt sick. Then I looked at the transfers labelled for Meredith. They were less regular but larger. $1,000 here for a business emergency. $1,500 there for a temporary cash flow problem. $2,000 for her car, down payment. $3,000 when she had to pay back taxes. The list went on and on. When I finally calculated everything to adding it all up properly in a spreadsheet because I couldn't quite believe the running total in my head, I stared at the number at the bottom of the column. $127,000. $127,000. Over 7 years. To people who couldn't remember my birthday, who interrupted me at dinner, who let their 8-year-old pour juice on me and then asked me to apologise for making him feel bad about it. I sat back in my chair still wearing my juice-stained clothes and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Something more final. It was clarity, pure and sharp. Not once in 7 years had anyone asked if I could afford these payments. Not once had anyone checked in to see if I was okay, if I needed help, if I was struggling. They just took and took and took, assuming the well would never run dry because I'd never given them reason to think otherwise. Margaret's words came back to me with force. Silence can be complicity. She was right. By staying silent every time they hurt me, every time they overlooked me, every time they prioritized everyone else's comfort over mine, I became complicit in my own mistreatment. I taught them this pattern. I showed them that Alison would always give, always forgive, always come back for more. I taught them wrong. And now it was time to teach them something different. Not with words had never worked with them. Not with confrontation, they'd just turn it around and make me the problem. But with action. Clear, decisive, boundary-setting action. I opened my laptop and made a decision that would change everything. My banking app was still open on my laptop screen, showing the transactions page with all those automatic transfers lined up like soldiers. I'd set most of them up years ago and then never looked at them again, trusting that the money was going where it was needed, assuming it was appreciated, even if no one said so out loud. I clicked on the first one. Recurring transfer to Robert and Patricia Butler, $500 monthly. My parents. This was the one I'd set up first 7 years ago when Dad had mentioned they were having trouble keeping up with the mortgage after he'd taken early retirement due to health issues. I'd offered to help temporarily just until they got back on their feet. Temporary had turned into 7 years of automatic payments they'd stopped mentioning entirely, as if the money simply materialized in their account by magic. I clicked Cancel Recurring Transfer. A pop-up asked if I was sure. I clicked yes. The system processed for a moment, then confirmed Recurring Transfer cancelled. No further payments will be processed. Just like that. 7 years of support ended with 2 clicks. I moved to the next one. Recurring transfer to Robert Butler, $300 a monthly. This was the supplemental amount I'd added 3 years ago when they needed the roof repairs. It was supposed to be temporary too, just 6 months to help them pay off the contractor. But 6 months had turned into 3 years and the roof had been fixed within the first 2. I had no idea what this money had been used for since then. I'd never asked. They'd never explained. Cancel, confirm, done. There were smaller ones too. $50 a month to help with utilities during winter. $100 earmarked for household emergencies that I'd set up after Mum's car broke down. One by one, I cancelled them all. Each cancellation felt like setting down a heavy box I'd been carrying for miles, not realising how much it weighed until it was gone. Then I got to the more complicated ones. There was a joint account I'd set up 2 years ago, one that I funded, but my parents had access to for family expenses. The original purpose was helping with my grandmother's medical bills before she passed, but the account had remained open afterward. I clicked through to the transaction history and felt my stomach drop. Meredith had been using this account extensively, charges to her business suppliers, payments to her landlord, even personal expenses, clothing stores, restaurants, a payment to Lucas's private school. She'd been treating this as her personal emergency fund, and my parents had apparently given her access without ever mentioning it to me. I transferred every remaining dollar out of that account back into my personal savings, then closed it entirely. The system asked for confirmation 3 times as if it couldn't believe I really wanted to shut down an account with multiple users. I confirmed each time without hesitation. There were other accounts too, other arrangements I'd forgotten about because I'd set them up and then tried not to think about how much I was giving away. A savings account I'd opened in Dad's name to help him build an emergency fund. I'd been depositing $200 a month into it for 4 years. I was listed as a joint owner, so I transferred the entire balance back to myself and closed it. Nearly $10,000 returned in an instant. With each cancellation, each account closure, each transfer reversed, I felt something shifting inside me. Not anger, though I had every right to be angry. Not even satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter and deeper than that. It was the feeling of reclaiming myself, of drawing a line and saying this far and no further. I wasn't doing this to hurt them, I realised as I worked through the list of financial entanglements. I was doing this to protect myself, to establish the boundary I should have set 7 years ago when that first temporary payment turned permanent. To teach them and myself that my resources, my energy, my care were not infinite wells they could draw from without reciprocation. The entire process took about 45 minutes. When I was done, I sat back and looked at the confirmation emails flooding my inbox. Recurring transfer cancelled. Account closed. Transfer completed. A digital paper trail of boundaries being established, of financial ties being severed. My phone was sitting face down on the desk next to my laptop. I picked it up and looked at the family group chat. The last message was from my mother, sent about an hour ago. "Alison left without dessert. Is everything okay?" Meredith had responded with a shrugging emoji. "She got weird about Lucas spilling juice. I think she's just having a bad day." A bad day. That's what they had decided this was. Not a consequence of their years of mistreatment, not a response to being humiliated and then asked to apologise for it. Just Alison having a bad day, being dramatic, overreacting as usual. I could have responded, could have typed out a long explanation of exactly what I'd just done and why. Could have given them a chance to apologise, to promise to do better, to beg me to reconsider. But I didn't. Words hadn't worked for 7 years. Words had gotten me nowhere except further into the background, further into the role of the family ATM that occasionally made inconvenient noises, but could ultimately be ignored. They'd proven tonight that no amount of verbal communication would reach them. They'd literally watched their 8-year-old pour juice on me and asked me to make him feel better about it. No, words were done. Now it was time for action, clear and unambiguous. I set my phone back down without responding to the group chat. I didn't block anyone. I didn't send a dramatic farewell message. I just let the silence speak for itself. They would figure out what had happened soon enough when the first of the month came and the money didn't. When they checked that joint account and found it empty and closed. When they realised their safety net had disappeared as quietly and completely as I'd been disappearing at their dinner tables for years. I finally stood up and walked to my bathroom, peeling off the juice-stained clothes that had dried stiff and uncomfortable against my skin. I threw the white blouse directly into the trash. There was no saving it, and I didn't want to save it anyway. It could serve as a reminder sitting there in the garbage of the last time I let them treat me that way. The shower was hot and long, washing away the sticky residue of cranberry juice and the heavier residue of years of accumulated hurt. When I got out, I felt cleaner than I had in a long time. I put on comfortable pajamas, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on my couch in the peaceful quiet of my own apartment. For the first time in 7 years, I went to bed knowing that I wasn't funding my own mistreatment. I wasn't paying people to overlook me, to dismiss me, to treat me as less than. The financial umbilical cord that had kept me tied to their dysfunction was severed. Whatever happened next would happen without my money smoothing the way. I fell asleep easily, deeply, the sleep of someone who'd finally set down a burden they'd been carrying far too long. The next morning, I woke up to my phone vibrating so hard it had fallen off my nightstand. 87 missed calls. I picked up my phone from where it had vibrated itself onto the floor. The screen was a mess of notifications, missed calls, voicemails, text messages, all time-stamped, starting around 11 o'clock the night before and continuing through the early morning hours. 87 missed calls. I counted them twice to be sure. 61 were from Meredith, 18 from my mother, 8 from my father. Even the distribution told a story, Meredith, the most panicked, the most desperate. Of course she was. She had been drawing from that joint account for who knows how long, treating my money like her personal emergency fund. I sat on the edge of my bed and started listening to the voicemails, playing them on speaker while I got dressed. The progression was almost fascinating in its predictability. The first one from Meredith at 11:14 p.m. "Hey, I was just checking my account and I think there might be some kind of error. The transfer didn't go through. Can you call me when you get this?" Her voice was casual, unconcerned. She assumed it was a technical glitch, something I'd fix immediately once I noticed. The second one, 11:47 p.m. "Alison, seriously, I need you to call me back." I have payments that are supposed to go through tomorrow, and the money's not there. Did you change your account or something? Now there was an edge of irritation, as if I'd inconvenienced her by not being available at midnight to explain my banking decisions. By the fifth voicemail, around 1:30 a.m, the panic had set in. Where is the money? I have bills due. On Monday, I have checks that are going to bounce. You can't just cut me off without warning. Her voice was shrill, accusatory. Still no acknowledgement of why I might have done this. No moment of self-reflection about what had happened at dinner. Just outrage that her ATM had stopped dispensing cash. The messages continued in that vein, getting progressively more frantic and angry. This is so immature, Alison. You're going to ruin my credit. I can't believe you do this over something so stupid. Mum and Dad are going to be so disappointed in you. Not once did she apologise. Not once did she say, I'm sorry about what happened with Lucas. Not once did she demonstrate even the smallest understanding that her actions might have consequences. My parents' voicemails were different in tone, but equally revealing. My mother's first message left around midnight. Honey, I'm not sure what's happening, but your father just checked the account and the payment didn't come through. We have the contractor coming Monday for the last payment on the roof. Can you please call us first thing in the morning? My father's messages were more businesslike, as if I were a bank he was lodging a complaint with. Alison, we need to discuss the payment issue. The contractor won't complete the work without the final instalment. This is going to cause significant problems. Please call back as soon as possible. None of them asked if I was okay. None of them referenced the juice incident or wondered if maybe, just maybe, that had something to do with my sudden financial withdrawal. They were so focused on the money and what they needed that it didn't even occur to them to consider what had prompted this change. I finished getting dressed and walked to my kitchen, putting my phone on the counter while I made coffee. The voicemails continued to play in the background, a soundtrack of panic and entitlement. Meredith's voice got increasingly sharp. My mother's got progressively more worried. My father's remained controlled, but with an undertone of frustration that I was causing this inconvenience. While the coffee brewed, I looked out my window at the sunny Sunday morning. It was beautiful, clear skies, leaves turning golden, the kind of autumn day that made you want to be outside. I decided that's exactly what I would do. I'd take my coffee and go for a walk in the park. Maybe sit on a bench and read. Maybe just exist peacefully in a space where no one needed anything from me. I poured my coffee added cream exactly the way I liked it, without anyone commenting that I should drink it black or that I was using too much sugar. I took my time. The voicemails had stopped playing. I'd reached the end of the queue. 87 calls, and I'd listened to maybe 15 of the voicemails before getting bored with the repetitive themes of panic and blame. My phone buzzed with a new text message, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. I glanced at the screen and saw they were all to the family group chat. Meredith. Has anyone heard from Alison? This is getting ridiculous. My mother, I'm very worried. This isn't like her. Meredith, she's being childish. She's obviously ignoring us on purpose. My father, we need to handle this in person. This is too important for text messages. My mother, I agree, I'll send a message. Then a new text came through, this one in the group chat, but clearly directed at me. Family meeting at our house tonight, 6 o'clock. Everyone must be there. We need to discuss something important. I read the message twice, noting the phrasing. Not, can we meet to talk, walk? Not, would you be available for a conversation? Not even, we'd like to understand what's going on. Just a command. Everyone must be there, like I was a child being summoned to the principal's office, expected to show up and explain myself to the people who should be explaining themselves to me. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. They still didn't get it. They thought they could summon me demand my presence treat this like I was the one who'd done something wrong. They thought if they just got me in a room, they could guilt me back into compliance, back into the role of the easy daughter who fixed problems and asked for nothing in return. Part of me wanted to type back exactly what I was thinking, that I wouldn't be attending their meeting, that they had no right to demand anything from me, that they'd created this situation by treating me like garbage for years. But I remembered the lesson from last night. Words didn't work with them, action did. So I didn't respond to the group chat. I just put my phone in my pocket, grabbed my book and my coffee, and headed out the door for my walk. The park was peaceful. I found a bench near the pond where ducks were paddling around completely unbothered by human drama. I sat there for 2 hours reading my book, watching people jog past and families play with their dogs. My phone buzzed periodically in my pocket. More calls, more texts, more demands for my attention and explanation. I ignored all of it. For the first time in 7 years, I was prioritizing my own peace over their panic. I was choosing my quiet Sunday morning over their emergency that only existed because they had been living on my dime for so long, they'd forgotten how to function without it. Around noon, I stopped for lunch at a small cafe, ordering exactly what I wanted without worrying about the cost. When the bill came, I realised this meal cost less than what I'd been automatically transferring to my parents every single day. Every day for 7 years, I'd been giving them more than a nice lunch cost, and they'd never once taken me out to lunch to say thank you. By the time I got home that afternoon, I had 134 missed calls. The group chat had 17 new messages, escalating from concern to frustration to outright anger. The last one from Meredith sent just 20 minutes ago. Fine, don't come. But you're going to have to face us eventually, and when you do, you better have a damn good explanation. I made myself dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed early. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my decision. And they demanded I come to a family meeting. This would be interesting. I decided to go to the meeting. Not because they'd demanded it, but because I wanted to see their faces when they realised I wasn't going to cave. I wanted to watch them try to manipulate someone who'd finally figured out how the game worked. I arrived at 6:15 intentionally late. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see them all through the living room window, my parents on the couch, Meredith pacing Lucas, presumably somewhere upstairs or in another room. They looked tense, agitated, like people waiting for a confrontation they were certain they'd win. I took my time getting out of the car, straightening my jacket, checking my reflection in the side mirror. I looked calm, professional, like someone who had her life together and wasn't about to be bullied into giving it away anymore. The front door opened before I could knock. My father stood there, his expression stern, the look he used to give me as a teenager when I'd broken curfew. "You're late," he said. "I'm here," I replied, stepping past him into the house. The living room felt different than it had 2 nights ago. The air was thick with tension, with unspoken accusations. Meredith stopped pacing when she saw me, her hands on her hips, her face flushed with anger, barely held in check. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands, looking between me and Meredith like she was watching a tennis match. "Sit down," my father said, gesturing to the armchair across from the couch. It felt like being called into an interrogation. I sat, crossed my legs calmly and waited. Nobody spoke for a moment. They seemed to expect me to start to offer explanations or apologies. When I didn't, my father cleared his throat. "Alison, we need to talk about what's going on with you," he began, his tone measured but with an edge underneath. "You've cut off all the financial arrangements we had in place, and you won't return anyone's calls. What's going on?" "I decided to stop sending money," I said simply. "That's what's going on." Meredith let out a sharp laugh. "Just like that. You decide to cut us off without any warning, without any discussion." "Yes," I said, just like that. "This is insane," Meredith snapped, taking a step toward me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I have payments that bounced. Mom and Dad's contractor is threatening to walk off the job. You can't just, I interrupted calmly. It's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. My mother leaned forward, her voice taking on that pleading tone she used when she wanted something. Honey, we don't understand. Why would you do this? We're family. We help each other. Do we? I asked, looking directly at her. Do we help each other? Or do I help you and you take... That's not fair, my father said sharply. We've always been there for you. When? I asked. The question hung in the air. When have you been there for me? Name one time in the last 7 years you've helped me with anything. One time you've asked how I'm doing, what I need, if I'm struggling. They exchanged glances, uncomfortable, unable to answer because there was no answer. The silence stretched out until Meredith broke it with a scoff. Oh, I see what this is about, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. You're jealous. You've always been jealous of me. Now that you finally have some money, you want to feel powerful. You want to punish us because Mum and Dad love me more, and you can't stand it. I stared at her, amazed at the audacity. This has nothing to do with jealousy, Meredith. Doesn't it? She pressed, warming to her theme now. You've never been happy for me. Never supported my business, never helped with Lucas the way an aunt should. And now, you're abandoning Mom and Dad when they need you most just to get back at me. That's pathetic. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said quietly. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. Boundaries. My father's voice was harsh now. We raised you better than this. Family takes care of family. That's not a boundary, that's selfishness. We've never asked you for anything unreasonable, my mother added, her eyes shining with tears that I suspected were more manipulative than genuine. Just to help out when things are tight. That's what families do. I know you were upset about the juice thing the other night. My mother continued, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. And I understand that. But this is too far, honey. You're hurting all of us over a child's mistake. Lucas didn't mean any harm. He's just a little boy. This isn't about the juice, I said, though we all knew it was. It was about the juice, and everything the juice represented years of disrespect, of being overlooked, of being valued only for what I could provide. Meredith moved to stand behind my parents' couch, placing her hands on my mother's shoulders in a gesture of solidarity. You need to understand something, Alison, she said, her voice taking on a threatening edge. If you keep this up, everyone is going to know what kind of person you really are. Aunt Carol, Uncle Jim, everyone at church, they're all going to hear about how you abandoned your elderly parents in their time of need. Meredith, my mother said weakly, but she didn't actually tell her to stop. I'm serious, Meredith continued, her eyes locked on mine. You think you can just walk away from this family? You think there won't be consequences? I'll make sure everyone knows that you cut off Mum and Dad while Dad's dealing with health issues. That you pulled financial support while they're in the middle of necessary home repairs. I'll tell them everything. She was threatening me. Standing in our parents' living room, threatening to destroy my reputation in the extended family and community unless I resumed funding their lifestyle. And my parents were sitting there saying nothing, allowing it to happen. I looked at the three of them, my father stern and disapproving, my mother tearful and guilt-tripping, Meredith aggressive and threatening, and I realised something with perfect clarity. This wasn't a family meeting. This was an intervention designed to bring me back in line. They'd coordinated their approaches. Dad would be the authority figure, Mum would be the emotional manipulator, and Meredith would be the enforcer. They'd probably discussed a strategy before I arrived, assigned roles, prepared their arguments. They thought if they just applied enough pressure, I'd crack. I'd apologise. I'd restore the money flow and go back to being the convenient, invisible daughter who existed to serve everyone else's needs. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I stood up slowly and they all tensed, expecting an explosion or a tearful breakdown. Instead, I picked up my purse and looked at each of them in turn. "I'm not going to argue with you," I said calmly. "You're not going to guilt me or threaten me into changing my mind. The money is done. The automatic transfers are cancelled. Whatever financial arrangements you thought we had are over." "Alison," my mother started, but I held up my hand. "I'm done," I repeated. "And if you want to tell Aunt Carol or anyone else that I'm a terrible daughter for setting boundaries, go ahead. I'll survive your gossip. The question is, will you survive without my money?" I walked toward the door, and Meredith's voice followed me, sharp and vindictive. "You're going to regret this." I paused at the doorway and looked back at her. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. I walked out into the cool evening air, got in my car, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the doorway, lit from behind by the living room lights, looking shocked that I'd actually left. I realised right then that the war had just begun. For 2 weeks, I lived in blissful silence. No family dinners, no guilt-tripping phone calls that I actually answered, no demands on my time or money. I went to work, came home, saw friends, read books, existed as a person with my own life instead of as an extension of my family's needs. I'd blocked Meredith's number after she sent a string of hostile texts calling me selfish and vindictive. My parents I left unblocked, though I didn't answer their calls. I told myself it was in case of real emergencies, though part of me wondered if there was such a thing as a real emergency with them anymore, or if everything was just varying degrees of manufactured drama. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was in a meeting at work, my phone started vibrating with call after call from my mother. I ignored the first 3, but when she called a 4th time in 5 minutes, my stomach dropped. That was the pattern for genuine emergencies, the kind of persistent calling that meant something was actually wrong. I stepped out of the meeting and called her back. She answered on the first ring, her voice high and panicked in a way I'd never heard before. "Alison, oh, thank God, your father collapsed. We're at the house, the ambulance just left, but we need you here right away. He's having heart problems, serious heart problems, and..." Her voice broke into sobs. My entire body went cold. "What hospital?" I asked, already grabbing my purse and heading for the elevator. "We're at home," she said through tears. "Come here first, please. We need to talk to you about something urgent. Just please, come now." I didn't question it. Didn't stop to wonder why she wanted me at the house instead of the hospital. I just drove, my heart pounding, my mind racing through all the worst possibilities. Dad was only 62, too young for serious heart problems. But he'd had high blood pressure for years, had been stressed about money, lately hadn't been taking care of himself the way he should. This is my fault, I thought, as I sped through yellow lights. The stress of losing my financial support caused this. I did this. By the time I pulled into their driveway, I was already second-guessing everything. Maybe I'd been too harsh. Maybe cutting them off completely was extreme. Maybe I should have communicated better, set boundaries more gradually. What if Dad died and the last real conversation we'd had was that hostile family meeting where I'd walked out? The front door opened before I could knock, and my mother pulled me inside, her face red and puffy from crying. "Oh, Alison, it's so awful. The doctor is here and he's explaining everything, but we need help. She led me into the living room and I stopped short. My father was sitting in his recliner, not lying down, not hooked up to monitors, not looking particularly distressed beyond being tired. He was sitting up, fully dressed, a blanket over his lap, looking sheepish and uncomfortable. "Dad," I said, confused. "I thought Mum said you collapsed." "He did collapse," Meredith's voice came from behind me. I turned to find her standing in the doorway to the kitchen, her arms crossed. "This morning. It was terrifying. The paramedics checked him out and said he needs immediate intervention." A man I didn't recognise stood up from the other armchair, late 50s, wearing business casual clothes with a stethoscope around his neck in a way that seemed almost theatrical. I'm Dr. Patterson, he said, extending his hand. I'm a friend of the family and your father's physician. I've been monitoring his condition. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite place what. Maybe it was the fact that Dad's regular doctor was Dr. Nguyen, and I'd never heard of a Dr. Patterson. Maybe it was the way Meredith was watching me with an intensity that didn't match the situation. Maybe it was the fact that there were other people here. I noticed Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim sitting on the far couch, and Cousin Beth hovering near the hallway. What's going on? I asked, looking between all of them. What happened? Dr. Patterson launched into an explanation that sounded medical and serious, but somehow didn't quite add up. Something about arterial blockage and urgent intervention, and a procedure that needed to happen within the next 48 hours or Dad could suffer a major cardiac event. And insurance won't cover it. I asked because that seemed to be where this was heading. Exactly. Meredith jumped in, moving to stand next to the doctor. It's considered elective because Dad's condition is stable right now, but Dr. Patterson is saying it won't stay stable for long. We need $50,000 by Thursday to get him on the surgical schedule. $50,000. I looked at my father, who hadn't said a word since I arrived, who was staring at his hands in his lap like he couldn't meet my eyes. Dad, I said quietly, are you okay? What do you want to do? I just want to be around for a while longer, he said, his voice rough. To see Lucas grow up. To see you girls. He trailed off, and my mother sobbed louder. The room felt like it was closing in. Everyone was looking at me with desperate, hopeful eyes. Aunt Carol had tears streaming down her face. Uncle Jim looked grave and concerned. Even Beth, who I barely knew, was watching me like I held her uncle's life in my hands. We've set up a family emergency loan, Meredith said, producing papers from somewhere and setting them on the coffee table. Everyone's contributing what they can, but we need you to anchor it. Just sign here and we can get Dad scheduled for the procedure tomorrow. She was pushing a pen toward me, her expression urgent but with something else underneath that I couldn't quite read. Triumph. Anticipation. I need to think about this, I said, but my mother let out a wail. There's no time to think. He could die, Alison. Your father could die, and you want to think about it. I looked at the papers on the table, at my father in his chair looking tired and old and small, at my mother genuinely hysterical with fear, at the doctor with his stethoscope and his serious expression, at my extended family, all of them watching me to see what kind of daughter I really was. This is emotional manipulation, a voice in my head whispered. This is exactly what they do. They create a crisis and make you the villain for not immediately fixing it. But what if it wasn't manipulation? What if Dad really was sick, really did need this procedure, really could die if I didn't help? How would I live with myself if I let my anger at their past behaviour cost my father his life? Just sign it, Meredith urged, pushing the papers closer. We'll work out the payment details later. Right now, we just need to save Dad's life. My hand shook as I picked up the pen. I tried to read the papers, but the text was dense and legal, and everyone was staring at me with such pressure that I couldn't concentrate. I saw the words emergency family loan and repayment terms and my name on a signature line. We need to move fast, the doctor said gently. Time is critical with cardiac cases. I signed. My hand moved almost of its own accord, scrawling my name across the bottom of the page, while my mother sobbed with relief and Aunt Carol said, "Thank God!" And Meredith quickly gathered up the papers with movements that seemed too practiced, too prepared. "Thank you," my father said quietly, finally looking at me. But the expression in his eyes wasn't gratitude. It was something else. Guilt, regret. "I'll get these filed right away," Meredith said, already moving toward the door. "Dr. Patterson, can you help me make copies?" They disappeared together, and I stood there in my parents' living room, surrounded by my relieved and thankful family, feeling like something had just happened that I didn't fully understand. I didn't know it then, but I had just walked into her trap. 3 days after signing those papers, I still hadn't heard anything about Dad's procedure. No calls about surgery schedules, no requests to visit him in the hospital, nothing. The silence felt strange for something that had been presented as so urgent, so life or death. On Friday morning, I called my father's regular doctor's office, the one he'd been seeing for 15 years. Dr. Nguyen's receptionist confirmed he'd had an appointment that Tuesday morning, the same day of the supposed collapse. "Can you tell me what that visit was for?" I asked. "Let me check the notes." It was a routine blood pressure check. He came in because his readings had been a bit elevated, wanted to discuss medication adjustments. My stomach tightened. "Did Dr. Nguyen recommend any procedures, any emergency interventions?" "No, nothing like that. Just a prescription adjustment and a follow-up in 3 months. Is everything okay?" I hung up without answering and sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Elevated blood pressure, medication adjustment, routine follow-up. Not a collapse, not heart problems, not an emergency procedure that needed to happen within 48 hours or he might die. The whole thing had been staged. Dr. Patterson, with his convenient stethoscope. The panicked phone calls, my mother's hysterical tears, my father's sheepish silence. The entire extended family gathered like mourners at a deathbed, all of it orchestrated to manipulate me into signing those papers, into feeling so guilty and terrified that I'd do whatever they asked. I drove to my parents' house unannounced. My father answered the door in his gardening clothes, dirt on his knees, looking perfectly healthy and energetic for someone who'd supposedly been at death's door less than a week ago. "Alison," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "How was the procedure, Dad?" I asked coldly. His face paled. We decided to postpone it. The doctor said we could wait a bit, and I talked to Dr. Nguyen's office," I interrupted. "You had a blood pressure check. That's it. There was no collapse, no emergency, no procedure." He couldn't meet my eyes. "Meredith said it would be better if we exaggerated a bit, to help you understand how serious things were." "Exaggerated," I repeated, my voice flat. "You mean lied? You helped Meredith lie to me and manipulate me into signing papers I didn't read because I thought you were dying." "Your sister was just trying to—" "Where's Mum?" I asked. "I want to talk to both of you." What followed was 15 minutes of excuses and justifications. They'd been desperate. They needed money. Meredith had said this was the only way to make me understand how much they needed my help. They hadn't meant to hurt me. They'd thought I'd understand once I calmed down. Not once did either of them actually apologise. I left without saying goodbye and drove home in a fog of rage so profound it scared me. I'd thought the juice incident was the lowest they could go, but this was so much worse. They'd weaponised my love for my father, manufactured a medical crisis brought in my extended family as props, all to force money out of me through fear and guilt. That night, I composed an email to the entire family group. I kept it short and clear. I will not be providing any more financial support to anyone in this family. What happened this week was manipulation fraud and emotional abuse. The fake medical emergency crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. I will not reward that behaviour. Do not contact me asking for money. The answer will always be no. I sent it and then blocked every family member's number except my parents, and only because I thought I should leave one line of communication open. Though after what they'd just done, I wasn't sure why I bothered. For 7 days, nothing happened. The silence felt almost ominous, like the pause before a thunderclap. Then, on the following Friday, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment by certified mail. The return address was a law firm downtown Morrison Hayes and Associates. I signed for it with shaking hands and opened it at my kitchen table. "Dear Ms. Butler," it began in that formal legal language that immediately makes everything sound threatening. "This firm represents Meredith Butler Reynolds regarding certain financial matters." I read through it twice, my disbelief growing with each paragraph. The letter claimed that I'd entered into a verbal agreement, an established pattern of financial support with my family over the past 7 years. It argued that my automatic monthly payments constituted an implied contract, and that my sudden withdrawal of support without proper notice constituted breach of contract and financial abandonment. It cited my parents' testimony that I had promised to help them long-term, that they had made financial decisions based on my assurance that support would continue. The letter demanded I resume monthly payments of at least $800 to my parents and $200 to Meredith, backdated to cover the months I'd missed since cancelling the transfers. If I didn't comply within 10 business days, they would file suit for breach of contract and financial elder abuse. Financial elder abuse. They were threatening to accuse me of abusing my parents by not giving them money. Attached to the letter were witness statements, notarized documents from my parents confirming that I'd promised ongoing support, that they'd relied on this promise in making financial decisions, that my withdrawal of funds had caused them severe hardship. There were bank statements showing the pattern of transfers over 7 years, highlighted and annotated. There was even a statement from Aunt Carol saying she'd heard me promise at various family gatherings that I would always take care of Mum and Dad. The papers I'd signed during the fake emergency, they were referenced to, described as a family loan agreement that I'd entered into and then tried to back out of. Meredith had structured the whole thing to look like a legal obligation I was now trying to escape. I sat there with the letter spread out on my table, my hands trembling with anger and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. She was actually doing this. Meredith was trying to sue me into giving her money. She'd recruited our parents as witnesses, manufactured evidence, hired actual lawyers to harass me with the threat of legal action. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was legal warfare. My first instinct was panic. What if they could actually win? What if a judge looked at 7 years of payments and decided I had created some kind of obligation? What if the fake medical emergency papers actually bound me to something? Then I remembered that I worked with lawyers, good ones, people who dealt with financial contracts every single day. I called a lawyer, and that's when I learned the truth. His name was Robert Chen, and he came highly recommended by my firm's general counsel. He specialised in contract disputes and family law, which seemed to cover both aspects of my increasingly complicated situation. I met him the Monday after receiving Meredith's threatening letter, bringing every document I had, the legal threat, the papers I'd signed during the fake emergency bank statements, showing years of transfers, emails, text messages, everything. Robert was in his late 40s with greying hair and the kind of calm demeanour that immediately made me feel less panicked. He spread all the documents across his conference table and spent an hour reviewing them while I sat there occasionally answering questions about timeline and context. Finally, he sat back and folded his hands. First, let me address your immediate concern. No, they cannot successfully sue you for stopping voluntary financial gifts. Gifts are not contracts. The fact that you gave money regularly for years doesn't create a legal obligation to continue. Their claim of verbal agreement is baseless unless they can prove specific terms were discussed and mutually agreed upon. I felt relief wash over me. So I can ignore this letter? Not entirely, he said carefully. The letter is what we call legal harassment, using the threat of litigation to intimidate someone into compliance. But there's something here that concerns me more. He pulled out the papers I'd signed during the fake emergency. These documents. Did you read them before signing? No. I admitted, shame heating my face. They said my father needed emergency surgery and I signed them. Robert's expression grew serious. These aren't loan papers, Alison. This is a co-signer agreement for a business credit line. By signing this, you agreed to be jointly responsible for debts incurred by your sister's business. He pointed to fine print I'd completely missed. Up to $75,000. My stomach dropped. What? There's more. The document references existing obligations that you're acknowledging and accepting responsibility for. He looked at me over his reading glasses. I need to investigate this further. I need 2 weeks to request documents from the financial institutions involved to verify what you've actually signed and what liabilities you might have. Can you give me that time and not respond to their demands? Yes, I said immediately. Whatever you need to do. The next 2 weeks were torture. I went to work functioned normally on the surface, but underneath I was constantly anxious. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. Every piece of mail made my heart race. What if Meredith had trapped me into obligations I couldn't escape? What if I really was legally responsible for her failing business? I didn't tell anyone what was happening, not friends, not colleagues. The shame of being manipulated by my own family felt too heavy to share. Instead, I threw myself into work, stayed late at the office, and tried not to think about the investigation happening in the background. Then, exactly 2 weeks after our first meeting, Robert's assistant called. Mr. Chen would like you to come to his office this afternoon if possible. He said it's urgent. I rearranged my entire schedule and was sitting in his conference room by 3 o'clock, my heart pounding. The expression on Robert's face when he walked in told me everything I needed to know. Whatever he'd discovered, it was bad. I'm going to be direct with you, Alison, he said, sitting down across from me. What I found goes far beyond a family dispute. Your sister has committed several crimes and you're the victim. He opened a folder and pulled out bank documents I'd never seen before. These are loan applications from the past 18 months. Business loans, personal loans, credit lines, all of them have your name listed as a co-signer or joint borrower. He pointed to signatures at the bottom of each page. That's supposed to be your signature. I looked at the documents, my hands starting to shake. The signatures looked like mine at first glance, same basic shape, similar loops on the letters. But looking closer, they were wrong. The slant was different. The pressure was uneven. I never signed these, I said quietly. I've never seen these documents before in my life. I know, Robert said. I had them analysed by a forensic document examiner. These are forgeries. Meredith has been forging your signature on financial documents for at least a year, possibly longer. The room seemed to tilt. How much? The total liability is approximately $87,000 across multiple accounts. He let that sink in before continuing. Most of these loans are for her business, which, according to the records I pulled, is struggling significantly. She's behind on payments. Some accounts are already in collections. And because my name is on them as co-signer, I couldn't finish the sentence. You're legally liable for the entire amount if she defaults, which she's in the process of doing. Robert's voice was gentle but firm. This explains why she's been so desperate to keep your money coming in. She's been using your funds to make minimum payments on debts she fraudulently incurred in your name. Without your monthly support, she can't keep the accounts current, and once they default, the creditors will come after you. I put my head in my hands trying to process what this meant. My credit score, my financial future. Everything I'd built could be destroyed by debts I'd never agreed to take on. There's something else, Robert said, and I looked up at him, hardly able to imagine what could be worse. The papers you assigned 2 weeks ago during the fake emergency, they weren't adding new liability. They were trying to get you to acknowledge and accept the existing forged debts. If you'd made any payments under that agreement, you would have validated the fraud and made it much harder to dispute. She was trying to cover her tracks, I said, slowly understanding dawning. Make it look like I'd agreed to everything all along. Exactly. And the lawsuit threat. That was to scare you into compliance before you discovered what she'd done. Robert leaned forward, his expression grave. Alison, what your sister has done isn't just unethical. It's illegal. This is identity theft under federal law, financial fraud, forgery. These are criminal offences, not civil matters. Criminal I repeated the word feeling foreign in my mouth when applied to my own sister. You have enough evidence to press charges. In fact, I strongly recommend you do, because without a police report and criminal investigation, you're going to have a very difficult time disputing these debts with the creditors. He pushed a document across the table. This is an affidavit of fraud for you to sign. It will start the process of removing your name from these accounts and reporting the crime to the appropriate authorities. I stared at the paper, at words like criminal complaint and identity theft victim and request for prosecution. If I signed this, the police would get involved. There would be an investigation. Meredith could go to prison. My sister, Lucas's mother, my parents' daughter. What if I don't sign it? I asked quietly. What if I just try to work it out with the creditors directly? Robert's expression was sympathetic but firm. Then you'll be legally responsible for $87,000 in debt, plus whatever additional debt she incurs before the accounts are frozen. Your credit will be destroyed. You could face wage garnishment. You might have to declare bankruptcy. And Meredith will face no consequences for committing fraud against you, which means she'll likely do it again when she gets desperate enough. But if I do sign it, then there will be a criminal investigation. The debts will be flagged as fraudulent, and you'll be protected from liability. Meredith will face charges. She could go to prison, though first-time white-collar offenders often get probation and restitution orders instead. I looked at the affidavit again, and my family name typed at the top, at the checkbox marked relationship to suspect sister. I had a choice: protect my family's reputation, let Meredith get away with destroying my financial future, continue being the easy daughter who absorbed everyone else's bad behaviour without consequences, or protect myself. I stared at that affidavit for a long time, the pen Robert handed me feeling impossibly heavy. My hand hovered over the signature line, but I couldn't make myself sign. Not yet. Can I take this home? I asked. Think about it overnight. Robert nodded slowly. Of course, but Alison, the longer you wait, the more damage accumulates. Every day that passes is another day. Creditors might start collection actions against you. I understand. I need one night. I drove home in a daze, the unsigned affidavit sitting on my passenger seat like an accusation. This was Meredith, my sister. I'd watched her grow up, held her when our grandmother died, been in her wedding, even though she'd barely acknowledged me during the ceremony. She was Lucas's mother, the only parent he had since Derek left. If she went to prison, what would happen to him? Would he end up in foster care? Would my parents have to raise him at their age? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning through scenarios. If I signed the affidavit, there would be police investigations, maybe a trial. The whole family would know, the whole community would know. Meredith would hate me forever. My parents would never forgive me. I'd be the daughter who sent her own sister to prison over money. But if I didn't sign it, I'd be responsible for nearly $100,000 in debt I never agreed to. My credit score would be destroyed. I'd spent 7 years building financial security, and Meredith would wipe it out with her fraud. And what would stop her from doing it again when she got desperate? Nothing. She'd already proven she had no problem forging my signature whenever it suited her needs. Around 3 a.m, my phone rang. My mother. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Alison. Her voice was thick with tears. Meredith told me what happened, what you're planning to do. So Meredith's lawyer had warned her. Of course, they'd probably been in contact this whole time, strategizing about how to handle me. Mum, I don't think you understand what she made a mistake. My mother interrupted, her voice rising. A terrible mistake. Yes, but she's your sister. You can't send her to jail over money. She has a child. She's already struggling. This will destroy her life. She forged my signature, Mum. She's been committing fraud for over a year. Because she was desperate. Because her business was failing and she didn't know what else to do. My mother was crying harder now. Please, Alison, I'm begging you, don't do this. Don't destroy our family. We can work this out together. We can make a payment plan. But please, don't involve the police. A payment plan for nearly $90,000. Money I never agreed to owe. We'll figure it out. Your father and I will help. We'll all help. But please, please don't send your sister to prison. I won't survive it. Our family won't survive it. The guilt crashed over me in waves. I was going to be the one who destroyed the family, not Meredith who'd committed the crimes, not my parents who'd enabled her behaviour for decades, me for having the audacity to protect myself. After I hung up, my father called, then Aunt Carol, then Uncle Jim, all saying variations of the same thing. Family comes first. Meredith made a mistake. Don't ruin everyone's lives over money. We'll find a way to pay it back. Just don't involve the police. By morning, I was exhausted and more confused than ever. I called in sick to work the first time I'd done that in over 3 years, and sat at my kitchen table with my coffee staring at that unsigned affidavit. Then I called Robert back. If I don't report this, what exactly happens? His side told me he'd been expecting this question. Legally, you become responsible for all the fraudulent debts. The creditors don't care that you didn't sign the original documents your name is on them, and without a police report proving fraud, you can't dispute that liability. You'll face collection actions, potential lawsuits, wage garnishment. Your credit score will be destroyed, which affects everything, from getting a car loan to renting an apartment. And Meredith faces 0 consequences, which means when she gets desperate again, she'll do this again. But my family? Alison, I need to be very direct with you. Robert interrupted, his voice firm. Your family is asking you to sacrifice your entire financial future to protect someone who deliberately and repeatedly committed crimes against you. Not mistakes crimes. This wasn't an accident or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated fraud over an extended period. And they want you to just absorb the damage, ruin your credit payoff debts you never agreed to, and hope Meredith doesn't do it again. She's my sister, I said weakly, and you're her sister. Did that stop her from forging your signature? Did that stop her from potentially destroying your financial security? Did that give her even a moment's pause? He was quiet for a beat. This isn't about revenge or punishment. This is about survival. If you don't protect yourself here, no one else will. I sat with that truth for a long time after we hung up. Robert was right. My family was asking me to set myself on fire to keep Meredith warm. They were asking me to destroy my own future, to save her from the consequences of her choices. And they were framing it as my duty, my obligation as a daughter and sister, to sacrifice everything, because that's what family does. But that wasn't what family did. That was what victims did. That was what people pleasers did. That was what I had been doing my entire life, sacrificing my needs, my boundaries, my dignity for people who wouldn't do the same for me. I picked up the affidavit and read it through completely. Then, I picked up my phone and texted Robert. I'm ready to move forward, but I want to try something first. Within an hour, we had a plan. Robert would prepare all the documentation for a police report, but we'd hold off filing it for 48 hours. During that time, I would give Meredith one chance, one single chance to make this right. I called Meredith. She answered on the first ring, her voice wary. What do you want? We need to talk in person. You have 48 hours to make this right, or I'm filing a criminal complaint for fraud and identity theft. The line went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, you wouldn't. Try me, I said, and my voice was steady, certain. Coffee shop on Madison Street. Tomorrow at 2:00. Come alone. I hung up before she could respond and sat there, my heart pounding but my hands steady. I'd given her a chance, more than she deserved, more than she'd ever given me. What she did with it would determine everything that came next. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a wood table near the back window, away from the main foot traffic, but still public enough that Meredith couldn't cause a scene. I'd brought a manila folder containing copies of everything Robert had given me, the forged loan applications, the signature analysis from the forensic expert, the documentation showing Meredith's business was failing, and she'd been using my money to cover the fraudulent debts. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and weighted my stomach in knots, despite my outward calm. I'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but I still wasn't sure how it would go. Part of me hoped Meredith would show remorse, would see this as the wake-up call she needed to finally face what she'd done. The other part of me knew better. Meredith arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. She was dressed carefully, not too casual, not too formal, and her face was composed in an expression I couldn't quite read. She sat down across from me without ordering anything. "Well," she said, "I'm here. What's this about?" I opened the folder and slid the first document across the two of you. "This is a loan application for $35,000 from First National Bank dated 14 months ago. That's your signature at the bottom." I pointed. "And that's supposedly my signature as co-signer. Except I never signed this. I never even saw this document until 3 days ago." Meredith glanced at it but didn't pick it up. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't," I interrupted quietly. "Don't lie to me anymore. I had a forensic document examiner analyse these signatures. They're forgeries. You forged my name on this and at least 7 other loan applications over the past year and a half." I slid more documents across the table one by one. "Here's another one, and another, and another. $87,000 in total debt that you fraudulently incurred in my name." "You can't prove that," Meredith said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "I already have. The expert's report is right here." I showed her the analysis with its technical language about pen pressure and stroke patterns and probability assessments. "You committed fraud, Meredith. You used my identity without permission. You put my financial future at risk to cover your failing business. And you did it deliberately, repeatedly, over more than a year." She sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So, what do you want? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. There. Happy. No, I'm not happy, and I don't want a meaningless apology." I pulled out the final document, the one Robert and I had prepared together. "I want you to fix this. You have 2 options." I slid the document across the table. "Option 1. You sign this statement admitting what you did. You publicly confess to Mum, Dad, and the rest of the family. You work with my attorney to remove my name from all the fraudulent accounts and take full responsibility for the debts. You enter into a legal repayment plan for any damage you've caused to my credit or finances. And you never ever contact me again unless I initiate it." "And option 2, Meredith asked, her jaw tight. "I file a police report for identity theft and financial fraud within 48 hours. There will be a criminal investigation. You'll likely be charged with multiple felonies. You could go to prison." "You wouldn't do that," Meredith said, immediately shaking her head. "You care too much about family. You've always cared too much. That's your weakness, Alison. You're too soft." "Try me," I said calmly. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she laughed. Actually, laughed, leaning back in her chair with a sound that was half amusement, half disbelief. "This is amazing. You really think you've grown a spine, don't you? You really think you're going to march into a police station and file charges against your own sister? If that's what it takes to protect myself." "Yeah." "Bullshit," Meredith said, leaning forward now, her voice dropping to something mean and intimate. "I know you, Alison. I've known you our whole lives. You're the good daughter, the easy one, the one who never makes waves. You'll cave just like you always do. You'll convince yourself that destroying your sister's life over money makes you the bad guy and you'll back down. Is that what you're betting on? I asked quietly. That's what I know. She pushed the documents back across the table toward me. You don't have it in you. You're not strong enough to actually follow through. Mum will cry, Dad will give you that disappointed look, and you'll crumble, just like you always do. I looked at my sister across that table, her arrogant smile, her absolute certainty that she knew me, that she could predict exactly what I'd do. And I realised she was still seeing the old Alison, the one who'd existed before the juice incident, before I discovered the fraud, before I'd finally understood that kindness without boundaries was self-destruction. She didn't know me at all anymore. I stood up slowly, picked up my folder and put on my jacket. 48 hours, I said calmly. That's how long you have to sign that document and start making this right. If I don't hear from you by 2 o'clock on Friday, I'm filing the police report. You're bluffing, Meredith said, but I heard the first hint of uncertainty in her voice. I left the evidence on the table copies for her to review, to understand exactly what I had, exactly how serious this was. Then I turned and walked toward the door. Alison, Meredith called after me. You're bluffing. You won't do it. I pushed through the door into the sunlight and didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear Meredith still calling, her voice getting louder, more desperate. You won't do it. You don't have the guts. You're still the same weak little sister you've always been. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, my hand shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Not from fear or doubt, but from the sheer weight of the line I'd just drawn. For the first time in my life, I'd looked my sister in the eye and refused to back down, refused to let her manipulate me, refused to sacrifice myself for her comfort. The countdown had started. 48 hours. I pulled out my phone and texted Robert. Meeting done. She refused. Prepare to file on Friday. His response came immediately. Understood. Documentation ready? Meredith gambled that I wouldn't follow through. She was betting on my fear, my guilt, my lifelong pattern of choosing family peace over my own well-being. She was wrong. Friday, at 2 o'clock, I walked into the police station's financial crimes division with Robert and filed a formal complaint for identity theft and fraud. The detective who took my statement was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Martinez, and she reviewed my evidence with methodical care, the forged documents, the forensic analysis, the bank statements showing Meredith's pattern of behaviour. This is a strong case, Detective Martinez said after an hour of questions. But I need to be clear with you, investigations like this take time. We're talking weeks, possibly months. We need to verify everything with the financial institutions, interview witnesses, build the documentation for prosecution. During this time, you shouldn't contact your sister or anyone else involved. Can you do that? I nodded, though the thought of weeks in limbo made my stomach twist. I'd crossed the point of no return now. The police were involved. There was no taking it back. The first week passed in tense silence. No calls from Meredith, no messages from my parents, just quiet, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I went back to work, tried to focus on my clients, pretended everything was normal. Then on Monday of the second week, my boss called me into his office. His expression was grave, uncomfortable in a way that made my pulse spike. Alison, I need to ask you about something. We received an email over the weekend from an anonymous source claiming you're experiencing severe personal financial distress. He slid a printed email across his desk. It suggests you might be mishandling client funds to cover personal debts. I read the email, my hand shaking. It was detailed, specific, mentioning the lawsuit threat from my family, implying I'd been embezzling to pay them off, suggesting the firm should audit my accounts immediately. It was written to sound concerned, like a whistleblower trying to protect the company, but I recognised Meredith's work in every carefully crafted line. This isn't true, I said, my voice barely steady. This is There's a family situation and someone is trying to sabotage me professionally. I want to believe that, my boss said, and I heard the but before he said it. But given the seriousness of the accusation, we have to investigate. I'm sorry, Alison, but I need to place you on administrative leave while we conduct an internal audit. It's standard procedure. Administrative leave. The words felt like a slap. In 7 years with this firm, I'd never been reprimanded, never had a client complaint, never given them any reason to question my integrity. And now I was being suspended because my sister was trying to destroy my career, along with everything else. I cleaned out my desk under the eyes of colleagues who suddenly wouldn't meet my gaze. By that afternoon, the news had spread through the office. By the next day, 3 clients had requested their accounts be transferred to other analysts. My reputation, the one thing I'd built entirely on my own independent of my family, was crumbling. The 3rd week was the worst. I stayed home isolated, jumping every time my phone rang, hoping for news from Detective Martinez or my company's audit team. Instead, I got silence. The investigation was ongoing. The audit was ongoing. Everything was ongoing while I sat in suspended animation, watching my life fall apart. I started to doubt everything. Maybe Meredith was right. Maybe I didn't have the strength for this. Maybe I should have just paid the debts, taken the financial hit, kept my head down. At least then I'd still have my job, my reputation, my dignity. Instead, I had nothing but accusations and investigations and an uncertain future. Then, on Thursday of the 3rd week, my phone rang. Meredith. I stared at her name on the screen, my finger hovering over the decline button. I wasn't supposed to talk to her during the investigation. But 3 weeks of isolation and doubt made me weak. I answered. We need to talk, Joel, she said, her voice careful, almost gentle. One last time, face to face. I think we can still work this out before everything gets worse. I can't talk to you. The detective said, the detective doesn't need to know. Just meet me, please, Alison. Let me fix this. I know I messed up and I want to make it right, but I can't do it through lawyers and police. Let me talk to you, sister to sister. I should have hung up, should have called Robert immediately, but I was so tired of fighting, so worn down by the 3 weeks of anxiety and isolation. If there was even a chance Meredith was finally ready to take responsibility, maybe I could end this nightmare. Where? I asked. There's a cafe on Harper Street. Tomorrow at 10. Just you and me, no lawyers, please. The next morning, I drove to the cafe. She'd specified a small place I'd never been to, tucked into a shopping plaza. Meredith was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window. I sat down across from her, keeping my purse in my lap, every muscle tense. Thank you for coming, she said. Then her expression hardened. I'm going to give you one chance to drop the charges and restore the money, because if you don't, I will destroy you worse than you can imagine. And there it was. Not remorse, not an apology, a threat. I'm leaving, I said, starting to stand. Sit down, Meredith snapped loud enough that other patrons turned to look. You think you're so much better than me? You think filing charges makes you righteous? You're pathetic, Alison. You've always been pathetic. A doormat who finally grew a spine but doesn't know how to use it. I'm done, I said firmly, standing up fully now. That's when Meredith grabbed her coffee, still hot, still full, and threw it directly at herself. The liquid splashed across her chest and neck, and she screamed like I'd stabbed her. You attacked me, she shrieked, jumping up from her chair. She just threw coffee at me. Someone call the police. What? No, I didn't. I stood frozen, my hands out, coffee dripping from her clothes while she sobbed hysterically. A woman rushed over someone I didn't recognize, but who looked at me with horror and disgust. I saw it, the woman said. I saw her throw that coffee. That's not what happened, I said, my voice coming out weak, disbelieving. She threw it on herself. But Meredith was already on her phone, voice shaking, as she spoke to 911. My sister just assaulted me, yes, at Harper Street Cafe. She became violent when I tried to talk to her about family issues. Please send someone. 20 minutes later, I was in the back of a police car being read my rights. 2 hours after that, I was at the police station being fingerprinted for the second time in a month. This time not as a crime victim, but as a suspect. Robert arrived and got me released, but the damage was done. I had an assault complaint on my record. The cafe's security footage showed Meredith with coffee all over her and me standing nearby, but the angle wasn't clear enough to definitively show who'd thrown it. And there was a witness, Meredith's planted friend, who swore she'd seen me do it. As Robert drove me home, I felt utterly defeated. My job was suspended. My reputation was destroyed. And now I looked like a violent, unstable person who'd attacked her own sister. Meredith had won, or so I thought. I thought I'd lost everything, but Meredith had made one critical mistake. The mistake was thinking she could get away with it in the age of cameras everywhere. Robert called me early Sunday morning, 72 hours after the incident, his voice energized in a way I hadn't heard before. I found it. Get to my office. I need you to see this. I drove there, still in my pajamas, too desperate for good news to care about appearances. When I arrived, Robert had his laptop set up in the conference room, and his usually calm demeanour had been replaced by something close to triumph. I spent the last 3 days canvassing every business within a block of that cafe, he said, pulling up a video file. The cafe's cameras weren't helpful, but the convenience store directly across the street. They have an exterior security camera pointed at the street, and it captured the entire window where you were sitting. He pressed play. The footage was distant, but clear enough. I watched myself sit down across from Meredith, watched the conversation, saw myself stand up. Then, in perfect clarity, I saw Meredith pick up her own coffee cup and throw the contents directly at her own chest. The angle left no room for doubt. Her arm movement, the trajectory of the liquid, the way she immediately started screaming, it was all there, documented in grainy but unmistakable detail. That's evidence of filing a false police report, Robert said. And when combined with everything else, the fraud, the harassment, the pattern of manipulation, this gives us something powerful. She didn't just falsely accuse you. She staged it in a public place with a planted witness. This is conspiracy. That same day, Robert took the footage to the prosecutor handling my assault case. By Monday afternoon, all charges against me were dismissed. The prosecutor was more than furious. She was personally offended that someone had wasted police resources and court time with such an elaborate lie. She immediately added Meredith to the growing list of people she wanted to talk to about filing false reports. Then, on Tuesday, I got a call from my boss. Alison, can you come in today? We've completed our investigation. I drove to the office with my stomach in knots, certain they were calling me in to fire me. Instead, I was led to the conference room, where my boss sat with the head of IT and our HR director. First, I want to apologise, my boss began. Our investigation found absolutely nothing wrong with your accounts or your client management. Your finances are impeccable. You've done nothing wrong professionally. I felt tears of relief start to well up, but he continued. Second, our IT department traced that anonymous email. It came from an IP address registered to a coffee shop in your parents' neighbourhood. The shop's logs show it was sent from a device that accessed the Wi-Fi under the name Meredith B. We've documented this as harassment and will be filing our own complaint. He slid a paper across the table. You're fully reinstated effective immediately with back pay for the time you were on leave, and we owe you an apology for not investigating the source of that email before taking action. I walked out of that office feeling like I could breathe for the first time in a month. My job was secure. My reputation was being restored. The clients who jumped ship were being contacted with corrections to the false information they'd received. That same afternoon, Robert called again. Detective Martinez wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're moving forward with charges. Wednesday morning, I sat in Detective Martinez's office while she laid out what would happen next. We have overwhelming evidence of identity theft and fraud, the forged signatures, the forensic analysis, your testimony, and documentation from the banks. The false police report adds another charge. The attempt to sabotage your employment shows a pattern of harassment and retaliation. She looked at me seriously. We're ready to make an arrest. When? I asked. Today. I wanted to give you advance notice because I know this is your sister. I understand this is complicated. It was complicated. Despite everything Meredith had done, despite the fraud and the manipulation and the false accusation, she was still my sister. And when I imagined police showing up at her door, handcuffing her while Lucas watched, my stomach turned. But then I thought about the $87,000 in debt she'd fraudulently put in my name, the weeks of anxiety and isolation, the assault accusation that could have destroyed my entire life, the systematic, calculated way she tried to ruin me when I'd finally set boundaries. I understand, I told Detective Martinez. Do what you need to do. That evening my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered cautiously. Alison Butler, a male voice asked. This is Sergeant Thompson with the police department. Your sister, Meredith Butler Reynolds, has been arrested on charges of identity theft, fraud, filing a false police report, and obstruction of justice. She's being processed now and will be held until her arraignment tomorrow. You're listed as the victim in this case, so I wanted to inform you. I thanked him and hung up. Then, I sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment, letting the reality sink in. Meredith was in jail. The sister who tormented me, manipulated me, and tried to destroy me was actually facing consequences for her actions. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that I instantly recognized as my mother. How could you do this? Your own sister is in jail because of you. Our family is destroyed. I hope you're happy. I started to type a response, then deleted it. Then started again. Finally, I just turned off my phone. But the worst was yet to come for Meredith. And for our father. 1 month after Meredith's arrest, Detective Martinez called me into her office. The tone of her voice on the phone had been different. Not the professional efficiency I'd gotten used to, but something softer, almost reluctant. We found something during our investigation of Meredith's electronic records, she said when I arrived. Something that involves your father. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? She opened a file on her computer and turned the monitor so I could see. We subpoenaed Meredith's email accounts and cloud storage as part of building the fraud case. We found these exchanges from 6 months ago. The first email was from Meredith to my father, dated last February. Dad, I need your advice about something. I'm looking at these loan documents and Alison's name is on them as co-signer, but she didn't actually sign them. What should I do? I'm worried the bank might figure it out. I stared at the screen, my hands going numb. 6 months ago. Meredith had told him 6 months ago. Detective Martinez scrolled to my father's response. She would have said yes anyway if we'd asked her properly. She's always helped when we needed it. Just, let's not make this a big issue. Handle it quietly. Try to pay down the balances so it becomes a non-issue. The less everyone talks about this, the better. He knew, I whispered. He knew she forged my signature. There's more, Detective Martinez said gently, scrolling to another exchange from a month later. This time Meredith had written, the payments are getting hard to manage. Should I ask Alison for more money directly? My father's response, no. She's already pulling away from the family. If she finds out about the loans, she'll definitely stop helping and might even make trouble. Just keep managing it the way you have been. Maybe we can move some money from the household account to help cover. I couldn't breathe. While I'd been agonizing over setting boundaries, while I'd been feeling guilty for cutting off financial support, my own father had been actively helping Meredith hide her crimes from me. Not just passively ignoring what she'd done, but strategizing with her about how to keep me in the dark. "Is he being charged?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Detective Martinez shook her head. "The prosecutor reviewed it thoroughly. Your father didn't forge anything himself, didn't benefit financially from the fraud, and technically didn't actively assist in the commission of the crime. Being aware of a crime and not reporting it isn't itself criminal in this context. He had no legal duty to report his daughter's actions. So no, he won't face charges." "But he helped her hide it," I said, hearing the desperate edge in my voice. "He knew she was destroying my credit, putting me at financial risk, and he told her to just handle it quietly. Morally, yet what he did was wrong, but legally, it doesn't meet the threshold for prosecution." She looked at me with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Alison. I know this makes an already painful situation worse." I left the police station and drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead, didn't give them time to prepare or strategize or get their stories straight. I just showed up and rang the doorbell until my father answered. "Alison," he said, surprised. "We weren't expecting—" "You knew," I said, pushing past him into the house. "You knew about the fraud 6 months ago and you said nothing." His face went pale. My mother appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, looking between us with confusion. "I saw the emails," I continued, my voice shaking. "Meredith told you she'd forged my signature and you told her to handle it quietly. You helped her hide it from me. You actively participated in covering up her crimes against me."
That's a thing.
"Alison, I can explain." My father started, but I cut him off. "Explain what? Explain how you chose to protect your criminal daughter over your victim daughter. Explain how you told her to keep managing the fraud instead of warning me. Explain how you prioritized family peace over the fact that I was being financially destroyed." "I didn't want to break up the family," he said, his voice weak. "I thought if I just stayed quiet, you two would eventually work things out. I thought Meredith would figure out how to pay off the loans, and it would all just go away." "Work it out," I repeated incredulously. "She was committing federal crimes using my identity, and you thought we'd just work it out?" "You don't understand," my mother interjected, finally finding her voice. "Your father was trying to keep this family together. If he'd told you, you would have done exactly what you're doing now, destroyed your sister, torn apart the family. I didn't destroy Meredith," I said coldly. "Meredith destroyed herself when she decided to commit fraud, and Dad helped her do it by enabling her instead of stopping her or warning me." My father sank into his recliner, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing for everyone." "You weren't doing the right thing for me," I said. "You've never done the right thing for me. You've spent my entire life choosing Meredith over me, protecting her from consequences, and expecting me to just absorb whatever damage that caused. And even when she was literally committing crimes against me, you chose her. Again." "We're your parents," my mother said, tears streaming down her face now. "We love both of you. We were trying to protect both of you." "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to protect Meredith from consequences and protect yourselves from discomfort. I was just collateral damage. I've always been collateral damage in this family." I turned toward the door, unable to stand being in that house for another second. My father called after me, "Alison, please, we can fix this. As a family, we can—" "There is no we anymore," I said, without turning around. "You made your choice 6 months ago when you decided to help Meredith hide what she was doing. You chose. And now, I'm choosing." I got in my car, and drove away. My mother tried calling 3 times before I blocked the number. My father sent a long text that I deleted without reading. I told my parents I needed space. Time to process this betrayal, this revelation that my father, the person who was supposed to protect me, had actively participated in my sister's campaign to destroy me. I didn't know if I'd ever forgive them. But as the weeks turned into months, I stopped waiting for that moment of forgiveness to arrive. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the life Meredith had tried to destroy. My career recovered quickly once my company issued a formal statement, clearing me of any wrongdoing and explaining I'd been the victim of targeted harassment. Clients returned apologetic and embarrassed. My boss gave me a significant raise, calling it compensation for the ordeal we put you through. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, grateful to have something concrete and controllable to pour my energy into. 3 months after my last conversation with my parents, the prosecutor called. Meredith's attorney has negotiated a plea deal. She's pleading guilty to identity theft and fraud. The sentencing hearing is next Tuesday. You have the right to be there, and you can give a victim impact statement if you'd like. I thought about it for days. Did I want to stand in a courtroom and face my sister again? Did I want to tell a judge how her actions had affected me? Part of me wanted to stay far away, to let justice happen without my participation. But another part of me, the part that had been silent for too many years, wanted to be there, wanted to look Meredith in the eye one more time and show her I wasn't afraid anymore. I attended the hearing. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, less dramatic than the ones on TV. Meredith sat at the defense table with her attorney, wearing a conservative dress that was clearly meant to make her look sympathetic and remorseful. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but I saw her shoulders tense when she realised I was there. My parents were in the gallery looking diminished and exhausted, in a way I'd never seen before. My mother had aged years in the past 3 months. My father's face was grey, hollow. They didn't try to approach me. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Honor Patricia Walsh, and she had clearly read the case file thoroughly. When Meredith stood to accept her plea, Judge Walsh's expression was stern. Ms. Butler-Reynolds, you've pleaded guilty to 2 counts of identity theft and 3 counts of fraud. Before I accept this plea and move to sentencing, I want to be clear about what you've done. You systematically forged your sister's signature on financial documents over an 18-month period, creating debt in her name, totaling $87,000. When confronted, you attempted to manipulate her with a fake medical emergency, threatened her with frivolous litigation, sabotaged her employment, and filed a false police report accusing her of assault. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated, repeated criminal behaviour. Do you understand that? Yes, Your Honour, Meredith said quietly. The prosecution has recommended a sentence, and I'm inclined to accept it with some modifications. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation. Any violation of the terms of your probation will result in immediate incarceration for the maximum sentence allowed by law. You will pay full restitution to your sister in the amount of $85,000, including interest and associated costs. You will complete 400 hours of community service, and you will carry a permanent felony record, which I hope serves as a constant reminder of what happens when you prey on family members. I watched Meredith's face as the sentence was read. She remained composed, but I saw her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the defense table. The practical consequences started immediately. Within a week, Meredith's struggling business officially collapsed. No client would work with a convicted felon, and no bank would extend credit. Her bank accounts were frozen, while the court assessed what assets could be liquidated toward restitution. She lost her apartment when she couldn't make rent. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard she'd moved back in with our parents along with Lucas. 3 adults and a child crammed into that house that was already falling apart because the renovations had never been finished when I stopped sending money. But my parents couldn't afford to house all of them either. Without my monthly support, which had apparently been covering more of their expenses than I'd realised they'd been struggling for months. Now, with Meredith and Lucas to support as well, the situation became untenable. 2 months after the sentencing, I got a call from Aunt Carol. I thought you should know your parents are selling the house. They're moving to an apartment next month. The house they'd lived in for 30 years, the one I'd helped maintain with countless temporary payments for repairs and renovations, gone. They were downsizing to a 2-bedroom rental in a less desirable part of town, the only place they could afford, on my father's retirement income alone. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally experiencing the natural consequences of their own financial mismanagement without me as a buffer. But another part, the part that still remembered Sunday dinners before everything fell apart, felt a pang of sadness for what had been lost. I didn't reach out to help, didn't offer to pay for movers or contribute to the rental deposit. I'd learned my lesson about enabling their dysfunction. If they were going to rebuild, they would have to do it themselves. The legal punishment was comprehensive probation restitution, community service, a felony record that would follow Meredith forever. My parents' financial struggles were real and immediate. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But the legal punishment was nothing compared to what came next. The story hit the local news 3 days after sentencing. Not the big networks, just our community newspaper and the local news website, but in a town where everyone knew everyone, that was enough. Local woman sentenced for defrauding sister, read the headline, accompanied by Meredith's mugshot from her arrest. The article detailed the charges. The sentencing even quoted Judge Walsh's statement about systematic criminal behaviour targeting a family member. Within hours, it had been shared dozens of times on the community Facebook page. I didn't see it myself initially. I'd unfollowed anything related to my hometown months ago. But friends forwarded it to me, some with supportive messages, others just wanting to make sure I knew. I read the article once, felt a strange mix of validation and sadness, then closed my laptop. For Meredith, though, the article was just the beginning of a social exile more complete than any legal punishment. Through Aunt Carol, who seemed to have appointed herself the family's reluctant news correspondent, I learned how thoroughly Meredith's world collapsed. At the grocery store, people she'd known for years suddenly had urgent business in other aisles when they saw her coming. At church, where our parents had attended for over 2 decades, families found excuses to sit in different pews to skip the fellowship hour to avoid any interaction. It's not that they're being openly cruel, Aunt Carol told me during one of our occasional phone calls. It's worse than that. They're just erasing her, pretending she doesn't exist. Your mother cries every Sunday. I felt no sympathy for my mother's tears. She'd made her choices. The employment situation was even more dire. Meredith applied to dozens of jobs, receptionist positions, administrative assistant roles, even retail work, anything to start earning money toward the restitution she owed me. But every application required disclosure of her felony conviction, and every employer ran a background check. Meredith Butler Reynolds' fraud pulled up not just court records, but news articles, forum discussions, even a Facebook post from someone who'd apparently known her in college and felt compelled to comment on how she always seemed like she thought she was better than everyone. The internet had turned her into a cautionary tale. She finally found work at a grocery store stocking shelves for minimum wage. The same store where she'd once shopped with an air of superiority, complaining about the selection demanding to speak to managers. Now she wore a name tag and took orders from 20-year-old shift supervisors. But the worst part? The thing that finally broke through Meredith's remaining pride was what happened to Lucas. His private school asked my parents to withdraw him. They phrased it delicately, talking about the disruption this situation has caused, and what's best for Lucas and the other students. But the message was clear: they didn't want the child of a convicted criminal in their institution. Lucas transferred to the overcrowded public school in the district where my parents' rental apartment was located, a school with 40 students per classroom, and a reputation for being where kids went when they couldn't go anywhere else. The bullying started within the first week. Kids who'd looked up Lucas's mother online found the news articles and decided that made him fair game. Criminal's kid. Fraud baby. Did your mum steal your lunch money too? The cruelty of children armed with information and no understanding of its weight. Aunt Carol's voice cracked when she told me. He came home crying every day last week. Meredith finally had to go to the school, and you should have seen the way the principal looked at her when she walked in, like she was contaminating the building just by being there. I tried to feel nothing about Lucas's suffering. He wasn't the one who'd committed fraud. He was an innocent child paying for his mother's crimes, but years of being tormented by him at family dinners, of cleaning up his messes while he laughed, had hardened something in me. I felt bad for him, in an abstract way, the way you feel bad for any child in a difficult situation. But I didn't feel responsible for fixing it. The social exile was complete. Meredith, who'd spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of success and superiority, had become the town's cautionary tale. The business owner who couldn't be trusted. The sister who'd betrayed family. The mother whose crimes had damaged her own child. Every time she went out in public, she faced whispers and averted eyes and the knowledge that everyone knew what she'd done. For someone whose entire identity had been built on the appearance of success and the admiration of others, this public shame was a punishment worse than any jail cell. I knew Meredith well enough to understand that. She could have survived prison 3 years of structured time with a defined end. But this was indefinite. This was waking up every day, knowing that everyone in her community saw her as a failure and a criminal. Through all of this, I maintained my distance. I didn't gloat or feel triumphant. I just existed in my own life, finally free from the weight of their dysfunction. My career flourished. My friendships deepened. I even started dating someone kind and stable who thought my boundaries were admirable rather than selfish. I heard about Meredith's struggles the way you hear about distant weather real but not affecting you personally, until Aunt Carol called one last time. Meredith's hit rock bottom, she said quietly. I mean truly rock bottom. She's working at that grocery store, living in your parents' tiny apartment, watching her sons suffer every day. And yesterday, she did something I never thought I'd see. What? I asked, despite myself. She applied for a job cleaning houses. Someone who used to employ her at her consulting business is now going to employ her to scrub their toilets. That's how far she's fallen. And then Meredith had to do something she never thought she'd do. I didn't know what Meredith had to do that day, wouldn't learn about it until much later. At the time, I was living my own life, deliberately ignorant of my family's struggles. I'd stopped asking Aunt Carol for updates, stopped checking social media for mentions of them. I was done being pulled into their orbit. But 6 months after the sentencing on an ordinary Tuesday in December, Meredith's life reached a point I couldn't have imagined even in my angriest moments. She was working the closing shift at Morrison's Market, the grocery store where she'd stocked shelves for the past 4 months. The same store where she'd once complained about the quality of their produce and returned items with imperious demands to speak to managers. Now she wore a green polyester vest with a name tag that said Meredith. In corporate font, no, last name, no title, just another interchangeable employee. That night, her manager, a 23-year-old named Kyle, who'd been in Lucas's kindergarten class years ago, found her cleaning the employee bathroom. She'd been moving too slowly, he said, distracted. The evening stocking wasn't finished, and now she was behind on closing duties. I need you to pick up the pace, Kyle said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never imagined he'd one day be managing his former neighbour. This bathroom should have been done 20 minutes ago. I'm sorry, Meredith said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. I'll work faster. See that you do? I've got 3 write-ups on you already for productivity issues. 1 more, and you're gone. She scrubbed that toilet on her hands and knees, the smell of industrial cleaner burning her nose, her back aching from hours of lifting boxes and stocking shelves. This was her life now. This was what she'd become. Lucas was waiting outside when her shift ended at 10. He'd started walking to the store to meet her after her evening shifts because the bus schedule didn't align well with her work hours, and my parents couldn't afford the gas to pick her up every night. He was 9 now, old enough to walk the 6 blocks alone, but young enough that it still worried her. "Mum," he said when she emerged, still in her vest because she was too tired to remember to take it off before leaving. "Your manager was yelling at you. I could hear him from outside." Meredith looked at her son, at his too thin jacket that used to fit, but that he'd grown out of, at his worn sneakers, at the worry in his eyes that no 9-year-old should have to carry. "I'm okay, honey. Just work stuff." "But he was mean to you. You used to be the boss of people. Now people are mean to you." They walked home in silence, Lucas's small hand in hers, and something broke open inside Meredith's chest. Her son had watched her be humiliated by someone she used to condescend to. Her son was growing up seeing his mother as someone who got yelled at for not cleaning toilets fast enough. That night, after Lucas fell asleep on the couch in my parents' tiny living room, there wasn't space for him to have his own room anymore. Meredith sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she couldn't afford to buy and a realization she couldn't avoid anymore. This was what Alison had lived through. Not the grocery store job specifically, but the feeling underneath it. Being undervalued, being treated as less than, having your contributions dismissed, your worth measured only by what you could provide to others. Alison had built a successful career while their entire family looked down on her, treated her like she was the one who hadn't figured life out, expected her to be grateful for the scraps of attention they threw her way. And Alison had done it without committing crimes, without lying or manipulating or destroying someone else. She just quietly built herself up while Meredith and their parents tore her down over and over, year after year. Meredith thought about all the times she'd called Alison boring, predictable, unsuccessful despite her corporate job. She thought about telling her she didn't understand real responsibility because she didn't have children. She thought about the juice incident, the juice incident, and how she'd smirked and said relax, while Alison sat there humiliated and soaked. She thought about the forgery, the fake medical emergency, the lawsuit threat, the false assault accusation. Every escalating attempt to control and manipulate and force Alison back into the role of the family's silent supporter. And through all of it, Alison had just been trying to establish the most basic boundaries to protect herself from people who were supposed to love her. Meredith pulled out a piece of paper, actual paper, because she'd sold her laptop months ago to make a restitution payment and started writing. "Dear Alison," she began, then crossed it out. Too formal, too distant for what she needed to say. "Alison," she started again, "you were right about everything." The letter wasn't long. It wasn't flowery or full of excuses. It was just truth, plain and painful. "You were right. I was jealous of you. I was threatened by your quiet strength and independence. I spent years tearing you down because it was easier than admitting I was failing. I manipulated you, stole from you, tried to destroy you. And you were right to press charges. You were right to cut us off. You were right about everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm writing this because you should know that I finally understand what I did to you. I finally understand what strength it took for you to set boundaries with people who were supposed to love you, but only knew how to use you. I'm sorry. Those words aren't enough, will never be enough, but they're all I have. I hope you're happy. I hope you've built the life you deserve free from all of us. Meredith. She folded the letter and put it in an envelope, then set it on the table. She didn't have a stamp. Didn't know if she'd ever actually send it. Maybe it wasn't for sending. Maybe it was just for writing, for finally saying out loud, even if only to herself, what she'd spent 6 months of consequences learning to see. I didn't hear from any of them for 6 more months. I didn't hear from any of them for 6 more months, and in that silence, I built a life I never knew was possible. It started with therapy. Margaret, from work, the colleague who'd first warned me about boundaries, recommended her therapist, a woman named Dr. Lisa Huang, who specialised in family trauma and codependency. I'd been resistant at first, thinking therapy was something for people with real problems, not someone who just had a difficult family. You were systematically emotionally abused for decades, and then had your identity stolen by your own sister, Dr. Huang said during our first session, her voice matter of fact. I'd say that qualifies as a real problem. Over months of weekly sessions, I began to understand patterns I'd never named before. The parentification, being forced to act as an adult and provider from a young age. The scapegoating, being blamed for problems I didn't create. The golden child dynamic that had positioned Meredith as inherently more valuable than me. I'd spent 34 years living in a system designed to keep me small, giving, and guilty. Learning to recognise those patterns didn't erase the pain, but it did something more important. It removed my sense of responsibility for fixing them. I wasn't the problem. I'd never been the problem. As the months passed, other parts of my life transformed in ways I hadn't expected. At work, I received a promotion to senior director, a position that came with a corner office and my own team. My boss mentioned that I'd come into my own over the past year, showed a confidence and decisiveness I hadn't before. I didn't tell him that learning to set boundaries with my family had taught me to set boundaries everywhere with clients who demanded too much, colleagues who tried to take credit for my work, anyone who mistook my kindness for weakness. I started travelling, real travelling, not obligatory holiday visits, to my hometown. I spent a long weekend in Montreal, a week hiking in Colorado, 5 days at a spa in Arizona, where I read books and took naps and didn't answer to anyone. Each trip felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away without realising it. I made new friends too, people who knew nothing about my family drama, who knew me only as Alison, not as the reliable daughter or Meredith's less successful sister. We had dinner parties and book club meetings and lazy Sunday brunches that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine connection. And I dated. Not seriously, not yet, but enough to remember what it felt like to have someone interested in my thoughts, my preferences, my boundaries. Someone who asked what I wanted for dinner instead of telling me what everyone else had decided. Someone who respected no the first time I said it. For the first time in my adult life, I was happy. Not the performative happiness I tried to convince myself I felt while funding my family's dysfunction, but real, quiet, sustainable happiness. I did hear about my family, though. I'd stopped seeking out information. Aunt Carol would occasionally send brief texts with updates respecting the boundaries I'd set about not wanting detailed family reports. From these sparse messages, I learned that Meredith had kept every single job at the grocery store for over a year now, a record for her who'd always quit when things got difficult. She'd made every court-ordered restitution payment on time, completed her community service hours, attended every probation meeting. My parents had settled into their smaller apartment, found a church in their new neighbourhood, adjusted to living within their actual means. Nobody had asked me for money. Not once in 18 months. It was simultaneously validating and sad proof that they could survive without bleeding me dry, which meant they'd chosen not to for years. The one contact I did have, the one I'd allowed, was Lucas. His letters started arriving about 3 months after the sentencing, written in careful 9-year-old handwriting on lined paper. "Dear Aunt Alison," the first one began. "I'm sorry about what I did with the juice. I didn't know it was so mean. I'm learning about choices and consequences in my new school. I miss you. Love, Lucas." The letters came every week after that. Never asking for anything, never guilt-tripping, just communicating. He told me about his new school, about a friend named Marcus who liked dinosaurs, about a science project on volcanoes. He told me he was in counselling, now my parents' probation officer had apparently required it for Lucas after the bullying incidents, and learning about how hurting people hurt people. In one letter he wrote, "My counsellor says I used to act bad because nobody taught me better. Mom says she's sorry she didn't teach me to be respectful. I'm learning now. I wish you could see. I kept every letter in a box in my closet. I didn't respond to them. Dr. Huang and I had decided that maintaining that boundary was important for now, but I read them. And I felt something softening in me very slowly when it came to Lucas. He was still just a child who'd been raised badly. That wasn't his fault. One Saturday in early June, almost exactly 18 months after cutting off contact, I was volunteering at a community food bank. It was something Dr. Huang had suggested giving back, in a way that I chose that felt meaningful to me rather than obligatory. I'd been sorting donations for about an hour when I turned a corner carrying a box of canned goods. And there was Meredith. She was on the other side of the sorting area wearing jeans and a volunteer t-shirt, teaching Lucas how to organise food items into categories for distribution. She looked different, thinner. Her hair simpler, her face without the carefully applied makeup she'd always worn like armour. She was laughing at something Lucas said, her expression open in a way I'd never seen before. Then she looked up and saw me. We both froze, standing 20 feet apart in a food bank on a Saturday morning, the last place either of us would have expected to see the other. Then, one Saturday, I saw Meredith somewhere I never expected. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I stood there holding my box of canned goods, and Meredith stood there with a clipboard and 18 months of silence stretched between us like a canyon. Neither of us knew how to cross. She looked so different. Not just thinner, though she was. Not just simpler, though her appearance was stripped of the performative polish she'd always maintained. It was something in her posture, in the way she held herself. The defensive arrogance was gone. She looked smaller, somehow. More human. I expected her to approach, to start explaining, to try to manipulate this accidental encounter into something she could control. Instead, she just nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then turned back to Lucas, continuing to show him how to sort canned vegetables from canned fruits. It was Lucas who broke the stalemate. Aunt Allison. His voice was uncertain, like he wasn't sure I was real. Then, when I didn't disappear, he dropped the can he was holding and ran across the space between us. I barely had time to set down my box before he crashed into me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his face pressed against my chest. He was taller than I remembered 9-year-olds grow fast, but still small enough that his embrace felt fragile, desperate. "I've missed you so much," he said, his voice muffled by my shirt. Then he was crying, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed too big for his body. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. For the juice, and for being mean, and for not listening, and for—" "Lucas, breathe," I said softly, my hands automatically going to his shoulders. "It's okay. Breathe." "It's not okay," he said, pulling back to look at me with red, tear-stained eyes. "I was awful to you. I hurt you, and I didn't even care. And then everything happened, and Mum got in trouble, and we had to move, and I lost all my friends, and—" He stopped wiping his nose on his sleeve. "My counsellor says I have to take responsibility for my actions. So I'm taking responsibility. I was wrong. I'm really, really sorry." I looked down at this child who'd made my life miserable at family gatherings, who'd poured juice on me without remorse, who'd laughed while I cleaned up his messes. But the Lucas in front of me now wasn't that child anymore. This Lucas had been through something that had aged him, taught him empathy the hard way. "I got your letters," I said quietly. "Every single one." His eyes widened. "You did? I didn't know if you read them. You never wrote back." "I read them all. I kept them." I glanced over his shoulder at Meredith, who was standing a respectful distance away, not interfering, but watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Does your mum know you've been writing to me?" "Yeah. She helped me with the spelling sometimes." Lucas followed my gaze, then looked back at me. "She's different now. She's sad a lot. But she's nicer. She doesn't yell anymore. And she helps me with my homework. And she says sorry when she makes mistakes." I didn't know what to say to that. The Meredith I'd known didn't apologise, didn't admit mistakes, didn't help with homework, unless it made her look like Mother of the Year to an audience. But Lucas seemed to genuinely believe his mother had changed. Meredith approached slowly, her movements careful, like someone trying not to spook a wild animal. When she reached us, she gently touched Lucas's shoulder. "Hey, buddy, why don't you go finish sorting those vegetables? I need to talk to Aunt Alison for a minute." Lucas looked between us, uncertain. "You're not going to fight, are you?" "No," Meredith said, and her voice was tired, not defensive. "No fighting. I promise." After Lucas reluctantly returned to the sorting station, Meredith and I stood there in awkward silence. I waited for the excuses, the justifications, the manipulation that had defined every interaction with my sister for my entire life. Instead, she said simply, "You were right, Alison, about everything." I blinked, not sure I'd heard correctly. What? I was jealous? I was threatened by you? I spent years tearing you down because it was easier than facing my own failures. She wasn't looking at me, her gaze fixed somewhere around my shoulder like eye contact was too much. I manipulated you, stole from you, tried to destroy you. And you were right to press charges. You were right to cut us off. You were right about all of it. Meredith, I'm not asking for forgiveness, she interrupted, finally meeting my eyes. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to let me back into your life or to forgive the money or to forget what I did. I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did to you, what we all did to you, for years. I studied her face, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda. But all I saw was exhaustion and something that looked uncomfortably like genuine regret. I had to lose everything. She continued, her voice quiet. My business, my home, my reputation, my pride. I had to work minimum wage jobs and get yelled at by kids I used to look down on. I had to watch my son suffer because of my choices. I had to lose everything to finally understand what I'd put you through. And even then, it took me months to really see it. Why are you here? I asked, gesturing to the food bank around us. Volunteering. Part of my community service was at a different food bank. When those hours were done, She paused, choosing her words carefully. I kept coming back. And then I found this one closer to where we live now. Lucas comes with me on weekends. It helps him, I think. Seeing people who have less than we do. Understanding that we're not as bad off as it feels. This wasn't the sister I knew. The sister I knew would never voluntarily spend her Saturdays sorting donated food, would never admit to being wrong about everything, would never stand here without trying to extract something from me. For the first time in a year, I saw my sister, really saw her as a human being, complex and flawed and struggling. Not a villain or a victim, just a person who'd made terrible choices and was finally facing the consequences. After our volunteer shifts ended, Meredith asked if we could talk. Not at my parents' apartment, not at my home, somewhere neutral. There was a small coffee shop 2 blocks away, and we walked there in silence while Lucas ran ahead, excited just to be near me again. Inside, I ordered coffee. Meredith ordered water. Trying to save money, she said without shame, which was itself remarkable. The Meredith I'd known would have ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, just to maintain appearances. Lucas sat at a nearby table with a colouring sheet the barista had given him, close enough to feel included, but far enough to give us space. He seemed to understand instinctively that this conversation mattered. I wrote you a letter. Meredith began, wrapping her hands around her water glass. Months ago, after one particularly bad day at work. I never sent it because I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. But everything I said to you at the food bank, it was all in that letter. What changed? I asked. Between the trial and now, what actually changed? She was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. I spent my whole life thinking I was better than you because Mum and Dad favoured me. I built my entire identity on being the successful one, the business owner, the mother. the daughter who did everything right while you were just there in the background doing your boring corporate job. I remember, I said dryly. When my business started failing, I couldn't face it, couldn't admit that maybe I wasn't as successful as I'd convinced everyone I was. So instead of dealing with it, I took it out on you. If I could make you smaller, then by comparison, I'd still seem big. She looked at me directly. That's pathetic. That's who I was. Someone who needed to tear down her own sister to feel adequate. And the fraud? I asked, needing to hear her actually say it. The fraud was desperation combined with entitlement. I was desperate for money, but I was also entitled enough to think I had the right to your resources without asking, that your identity was just available for me to use. That's how little I valued you as a person with your own life. I sipped my coffee, processing. You could have just asked me for help. You'd already said no to giving more money. I knew if I asked about co-signing loans, you'd say no to that too. So I didn't ask, I just took. She paused. That's the mentality that led to everything else. The fake emergency, the lawsuit threat, the assault accusation. Each one was escalation because I couldn't accept that you'd finally set boundaries. The assault accusation almost destroyed my career. I said, my voice harder than I intended. I know, and you were right to press charges against me. Meredith's voice was steady, no excuses underneath it. I committed actual crimes, fraud, identity theft, filing false reports. Those aren't mistakes. Those were deliberate choices to harm you when you tried to protect yourself. I deserved every consequence I got. This was the part I'd been waiting for, the but that would turn this apology into another manipulation. But it didn't come. Lucas needed to see it too, she continued, glancing at her son colouring nearby. He needed to see that actions have consequences even for family. Especially for family. I spent his whole childhood teaching him that he could do whatever he wanted without repercussions. That other people's feelings didn't matter. That respect was optional. Her voice cracked slightly. I taught him to be a smaller version of me. Selfish, entitled, cruel, without even realising it. He seems different now, I offered carefully. He is. The bullying was awful, the worst thing I've ever watched him go through. But his counsellor helped him understand why it happened, how his own behaviour had contributed to not having real friends, how being spoiled had actually hurt him. She smiled sadly. He came home from counselling one day and said, "Mum, I think I was mean because nobody taught me not to be." And he was right. I didn't teach him boundaries or empathy or consequences, so life had to. And you, I asked, what did life teach you? That I'm not special, that I'm not entitled to anything I haven't earned, that relationships require actual reciprocity, not just one person giving while another takes. She met my eyes. That my sister was stronger than I ever was, and I spent years punishing her for it instead of learning from it. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me was waiting for the request for her to ask me to drop the restitution payments to help with Lucas's school expenses to reconcile with our parents something. But the request didn't come. "I'm not asking you to help us financially," Meredith said, as if reading my mind. "I'm not asking you to forgive me or let me back into your life or pretend the past didn't happen. I'm not even asking you to respond to this conversation. She stopped, struggling with words. "I wanted you to know that I finally see you, really see you, not as the convenient sister or the family ATM or the person who's supposed to absorb everyone's bad behaviour. I see you as someone who was strong enough to set boundaries with people who should have loved her better. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally look." I looked at my sister across that coffee shop table, her tired face, her simple clothes, her absence of pretense, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something softer than hate, something that acknowledged she was genuinely trying to be different. It was a start. It was a start. And over the following months, I learned that starts don't become finishes overnight. Meredith and I didn't suddenly become close. We didn't have long phone calls or sister shopping trips, but we'd exchange brief words at the food bank where we both continued to volunteer on different Saturdays. She'd ask how work was going. I'd ask how Lucas was adjusting. The conversations were short, polite, careful, but they were real. 3 months after that coffee shop conversation, my mother called. Not to guilt trip or manipulate, but with a simple request. Would you consider coming to dinner just family? No pressure, and I understand if you say no. I almost said no automatically, but Dr. Huang encouraged me to consider it. You've built strong boundaries now, she said. They can't be broken unless you allow it. Go if you want to see whether the changes are real. Leave if they're not. So, I went. My parents' apartment was small, a 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better days. But it was clean, and there were fresh flowers on the table that I suspected my mother had bought specifically for this dinner. Small gestures, they mattered. Lucas answered the door, and his face lit up in a way that made my chest tight. Aunt Alison, you came... Then catching himself, he added more quietly, I'm really glad you're here. Me too, I said, and meant it. The dinner was different in ways both obvious and subtle. Lucas asked permission before getting up from the table. He said please and thank you without prompting. When dinner was finished, he immediately started clearing plates, and when I moved to help, he smiled and said, I got it, you're the guest. Meredith was attentive, but not hovering. She'd made a simple meal, nothing fancy, nothing trying too hard. When she served food, she actually asked what I wanted instead of assuming. Small things. Everything was small things. But small things added up to something bigger. My parents were different too. My father asked about my promotion, listened to the answer, asked follow-up questions that showed he'd actually heard what I said. My mother mentioned an article she'd read about financial planning and wondered if I had any advice, not demanding my expertise, just acknowledging I had it. Alison, my mother said as we finished dessert, we need to say something. Your father and I have been working with a counsellor. We've learned a lot about how we failed you, how we enabled Meredith, and took advantage of your kindness. We can't undo those years, but we want you to know we see it now. We see it and we're sorry. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was genuine, and from my parents that was significant. Later, as Meredith and I stood in the small kitchen cleaning dishes together, while Lucas showed my parents a school project in the living room, I decided to be clear about something. I'm glad we're talking again, I said quietly. But I need you all to understand this doesn't mean things go back to how they were. I won't be the family bank. I won't be the one who always sacrifices. If I help, it will be because I choose to, not because I'm expected to. My life and my needs come first now. I braced myself for pushback, for negotiation, for the inevitable, but family helps family. Instead, Meredith just nodded. I understand. That's fair. That's how it should have always been. Really? I couldn't help the skepticism in my voice. Really? She dried a plate carefully. I'm still making restitution payments. I'll be making them for years. That's my responsibility. And honestly, having to earn my own way, having to be accountable for my choices, it's made me stronger. I don't want to go back to being someone who needed you to fix everything for me. Over the next months, this new dynamic held. I saw my family occasionally dinners every few weeks, Lucas's school events when I was invited casual coffee with Meredith at the food bank. But I also maintained my own life, my own boundaries, my own identity separate from them. The relationship between Meredith and me wasn't what sisters are supposed to be in movies or greeting cards. We weren't best friends. We didn't share our deepest secrets or call each other every day. But there was something more valuable than that closeness. There was respect. Real respect. She respected my boundaries. I respected her efforts to change. We acknowledged each other as equals, two adults who'd both learned painful lessons about what family should and shouldn't be. My parents learned to treat both daughters with equal interest and care. Lucas became a thoughtful, kind child who'd learned empathy through hardship. Meredith became someone who took responsibility for her choices instead of blaming others when things went wrong. None of us were perfect. We still had bad days, old patterns that occasionally surfaced moments of tension when boundaries got tested. But the difference was that now when those moments happened, we addressed them. We talked. We apologized. We adjusted. I learned that family isn't about people who never hurt you. It's about people who learn to respect you after they realize what they've done. It's about people who do the work to change, not just promise to change. It's about boundaries that protect rather than walls that isolate. My family isn't perfect now, but it's real. And sometimes that's more than enough. Looking back, I realized the juice incident wasn't the moment that changed my life. It was just the moment I finally saw what had been true all along. I'd been teaching people how to treat me by accepting treatment I never deserved. For 7 years, I funded my own mistreatment. I paid for the privilege of being overlooked, dismissed, and taken for granted. I thought that's what family meant: endless giving, endless sacrifice. But real family doesn't require you to destroy yourself to prove your love. Setting boundaries cost me the family I thought I had, but gave me something more valuable: a family built on respect instead of obligation, genuine care instead of financial dependence, equality instead of hierarchy. The family I have now isn't perfect, but it's real. And that's worth more than any illusion of harmony built on my silence. Meredith still makes restitution payments every month. She'll be making them for years. Lucas writes me letters about school and the lessons he's learning. My parents have learned to live within their means and treat both daughters equally. And I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people who are hurting you. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've been the one who gives while everyone else takes, I hope my story shows you it's never too late to draw a line. Boundaries aren't selfish. Protecting yourself isn't betrayal. Sometimes choosing yourself is the only way to save both yourself and the people you love. What would you have done? Would you have pressed charges against your own sister? Do you think my family genuinely changed, or would you have walked away permanently? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. You're not alone in this journey. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Thank you for listening to my story.